Welcome to Tales of Warriors channel. Today, we will dive into the riveting world of covert operations of the Israeli intelligence service, the Mossad. This is a compelling stories collection, unveils the clandestine endeavors of Israel's renowned intelligence agency, delving into thrilling accounts of daring missions, strategic triumphs, and the remarkable individuals behind them. Join us on a journey through Mossad's daring covert operations. In this video, we will discover the next 3 operations of Israel's Secret Service legacy. This video is suitable for those who have free time, are ready for bed, driving, or need something as background while studying, cleaning, or relaxing. Episode 7. Where is Yossel? While Issa, his agents, and the captive Eichmann were waiting in their Buenos Aires safe houses for the arrival of the Britannia whispering giant aircraft from Tel Aviv, the Mossad was busy with another project. Issa had decided to check the rumors that another Nazi criminal was hiding in the city, Dr. Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death, the monstrous doctor who would receive the trainloads of Jews on the Auschwitz platform and indifferently send the healthier-looking ones to work and the weaker, the women, children, and old people to the gas chambers. Mengele had become a symbol of the Third Reich's cruelty and madness. After the war he vanished, quite possibly to Argentina. Mengele came from a rich family. While he was in hiding, they continued to support him, funneling large sums of money to him. The money trail, followed by Mossad agents, led to Buenos Aires, yet so far they had failed in their efforts to find Mengele. But this time they were lucky. In May 1960, shortly before the Britannia landed in Buenos Aires, Issa's agents found Mengele's address. The man was living in Buenos Aires under his real name. Apparently, he was sure he was well protected. Issa sent his best investigator, Zvi Aharoni, to check the address, but Mengele was not at home. His neighbors told Aharoni that the Mengele couple had left for a few days, but they would soon be back. Excited, Issa summoned Rafi Eitan. "Let's watch and follow," he said, "and when Mengele comes back, we'll kidnap him, too, and bring him to Israel together with Eichmann." Rafi refused. "The Eichmann operation is very complex," he said. "We captured one man, and we have a good chance of succeeding in getting him on the plane and bringing him to Israel. But another operation for the capture of a second man would increase the risks tremendously. It would be a serious mistake." Issa gave in, and Rafi made him an alternative offer: "If you bring Eichmann to Israel and keep his capture secret for a week, I'll bring you Mengele." "How will you do that?" Issa asked. "We still have a few safe houses in Buenos Aires from the Eichmann operation, which nobody knows about. Let's keep them. When you take off with Eichmann, on your way to Israel, I'll fly with Zvi Malkin and Avram Shalom to one of Argentina's neighboring countries. You'll arrive in Israel and keep Eichmann's capture secret. Nobody will know we did it, and nobody will look for us. We'll return to Buenos Aires then, we'll take Mengele. We'll keep him in one of our safe houses, and after a few days we'll bring him to Israel." Issa agreed. When the Britannia, with Eichmann on board, took off for Israel, Eitan, Shalom, and Malkin flew to Santiago, the capital of neighboring Chile. They intended to return to Buenos Aires after a day or two, if Eichmann's capture was kept secret, and to launch Operation Mengele. But the following morning all the world's media announced in their headlines the capture of Eichmann in Argentina by the Israelis. It was out of the question that some of the leading Mossad agents would return to Argentina and carry out another kidnapping. Rafi and his friends had to abandon their project and return to Israel. Later, Issa Horel told Rafi that he had asked Ben Gurion to keep Eichmann's capture secret for a week, but the old man had refused. Too many people know already that Eichmann is in our hands, Ben-Gurion allegedly said to Issa, "We won't be able to keep the secret any longer. I decided to inform the Knesset of his capture this afternoon." Eichmann's capture was announced, and Israel lost its chance to bring to trial one of the most sadistic criminals in history. Shortly after the Eichmann capture, Mengele felt the ground was burning under his feet. He moved to Paraguay and vanished until his death of a heart attack almost 20 years later, in February 1979. In early March 1962, Issa Horel was summoned by Ben-Gurion. The old man greeted him warmly, chatting with him for a while about various subjects. What does he want? Issa wondered. He knew Ben-Gurion well, and was sure that he hadn't invited Issa in for small talk. The two men liked each other, and were similar. They were both short, stubborn, and decisive, born leaders of men, dedicated to Israel's security. They both weren't ones to waste time and words. And since Eichmann's capture, they had become much closer. All of a sudden, in the middle of the conversation, Ben-Gurion turned to Issa. "Tell me, can you find the child?" He didn't say what child he was talking about, but Issa understood right away. For the last 2 years, one question kept popping up all over Israel, screaming from newspaper headlines, shouted from the Knesset podium, and angrily thrown in the faces of ultra-Orthodox Jews by secular youth. Where is Yossel? Yossel was Yossel Schutzmacher, an 8-year-old boy from the city of Holon, who had been kidnapped by ultra-Orthodox Jews, headed by his grandfather. The old Hasid wanted to raise Yossel in the ultra-Orthodox tradition, and had snatched the child from his parents. Since then, the boy had vanished without a trace. Each day he remained missing. The dispute over the child grew, from a family affair to a national scandal to an increasingly violent confrontation between secular and ultra-Orthodox Jews. Some feared a civil war could erupt and tear the nation apart. As a last resort, Ben-Gurion turned to Issa. "If you want me to, I'll try," Issa said. He drove back to his office and had an operational file opened. He called it Operation Tiger Cub. Yossel was a good-looking, vivacious child. His only mistake, apparently, had been to choose the wrong parents. That was the opinion of his grandfather, Naaman Starks. Old Starks, skeletal, bearded, and bespectacled, was a fanatical Hasid, a man tough and stubborn. Nobody could break him, neither the KGB thugs, nor the Soviet labor camps in frozen Siberia, where he had spent a part of World War II. In Siberia he had lost an eye and 3 toes from frostbite, but his morale had remained intact. His vicissitudes had only fueled his hatred for the Soviets, which peaked in 1951 when a gang of hoodlums stabbed his son to death. He consoled himself with his other 2 sons, Shalom and Avodia, and his daughter, Ida, who was married to a tailor. The young couple lived for a while in Starkis' old home in Lvov, where they had settled after wandering through Russia and Poland. There, in 1953, the second child in the Schutzmacher family was born, Yossel. The boy was 4 years old when he immigrated to Israel with his parents. Grandfather and grandmother Starks, and one of their sons, Shalom, had arrived in Israel a few months earlier. Naaman Starks, who belonged to the Breslau Hasidim sect, settled in Mea Shearim, the ultra-Orthodox sector of Jerusalem. It was another world, of men wearing long black coats or silk kaftans, black hats or fur hats, bushy beards and long side locks, women in long, prim dresses, covering their hair with wigs or scarves, a world of yeshivas, synagogues, courts of famous rabbis. Shalom joined a yeshiva. His other brother, Avodia, moved to England. Ida and Alta Schutzmacher settled in Holon. Eventually, Alta got a job in a textile factory in the Tel Aviv area. Ida was hired by a photographer. They bought a small apartment and struggled to make a living. They went deeply into debt. To make ends meet, they sent their daughter, Zina, to a religious institution at Kfar and entrusted Yossel to his grandparents. Rocked by hard times, Ida and Alta Schuchmacher wrote to friends in Russia that perhaps they shouldn't have come to Israel. Some of the replies to the couple's complaints fell in the hands of old Naaman Starks. He concluded that the Schuchmachers intended to go back to Russia with their children. Seething with fury, he decided not to give Yossel back to his parents. By the end of 1959, though, the Schuchmachers' economic situation improved. They were better off now, and they decided to reunite their family. In December, Ida went to Jerusalem to pick up her child, but neither Yossel nor his grandfather was home. "Tomorrow your brother Shalom will bring the boy to you," Ida's mother said. "Right now he is with his grandfather at the synagogue, and you must not disturb them." On the following day, though, Shalom arrived in Holon alone, and told his sister that their father had decided not to give back Yossel. The distraught Ida rushed to Jerusalem with her husband. They spent the weekend at the Starks' house, and that time Yossel was there. On Saturday evening, when they were about to leave with the child, Ida's mother objected. "It's very cold outside," she said. "Let the child sleep here, and tomorrow I'll bring him back to you." They agreed. Ida kissed her son, who curled up in his bed, and left with her husband. How could she know that years would pass before she saw her little boy again? The following day, neither Yossel nor his grandmother showed up in Holon. Once again, Ida and Alta got on the road to Jerusalem. But to no avail. The child had vanished, and old Starks bluntly refused to return him, despite Ida's tears. Her son was gone. After a few more trips, Ida and Alta realized that the old man wouldn't give them back their child or disclose his whereabouts. In January 1960, they decided to turn to the courts. They lodged a complaint against Naaman Starks at the Tel Aviv Rabbinical Court. Starks didn't answer. And their nightmare began. January 15, Israel's Supreme Court orders Naaman Starks to return the child to his parents within 30 days and summons him to court. He replies 2 days later, "I cannot come because of my poor health." February 17, the family lodges a complaint with the police and asks that Naaman Starks be arrested and held in custody until he returns their son. The Supreme Court orders the police to find the child. 10 days later, the police open a file for Yossel and the search begins. April 7, the police cannot find any trace of the boy and ask the Supreme Court to be relieved of the search. May 12, indignant, the Supreme Court orders the police to continue with the search and finally orders the arrest of Naaman Starks. He is taken into custody the next day. But if anyone had thought that a stay in jail would break old Starks' resolve, they were dead wrong. The tough old man didn't say a word. It became immediately evident that Starks hadn't hidden the child by himself and had been helped by a network of ultra-Orthodox Jews who had deceived the police. They had all engaged in a sacrosanct mission to thwart the devious plan of taking the child to Russia and converting him to Christianity, or so Starks had told them. Even Rabbi Frank, chief rabbi of Jerusalem, published a ruling supporting old Starks and urging the Orthodox community to help him in every way. The question appeared on the Knesset agenda in May 1960 and the press had a field day. The first to realize the far-reaching implications of the affair were the representatives of the religious parties. Knesset member Shlomo Lorenz felt that the abduction of the child might ignite a religious war in Israel. He offered to Starks and the Schuchmacher family his services as a go-between. He brought to Starks, who was still in jail, a draft agreement saying that the parents promise to give the child an Orthodox education. Starks agreed to sign the paper on one condition, that Rabbi Meisish, one of the most fanatical rabbis in Jerusalem, would order him to do so. Lorenz hurried to Jerusalem and met with the rabbi. Meisish implied that he'd consent to the agreement only on condition that the abductors wouldn't be prosecuted. Now Lorenz went to the chief of police, Joseph Namias. "I agree," Namias said. "Take my car and bring the child. You have parliamentary immunity, and no one would follow my car anyway, so the people involved will remain unknown." Overjoyed, Lorenz returned to Rabbi Meisish, but the rabbi changed his mind. Lorenz was back at square one. He knew that the child was probably hidden in one of the religious communities, Talmudic schools, or Orthodox villages. But impeded by a wall of silence, finding the child there was an impossible mission. On April 12, 1961, Naaman Starks was released from jail for reasons of health, after he had promised he'd try to find the little boy. But he didn't keep his word, and the Supreme Court had him arrested again, stating that the abduction was a shocking and despicable crime. In August 1961, a National Committee for the Return of Yossel was created, and it started distributing leaflets, organizing public meetings, alerting the media. Many thousand signed its petitions. The sinister shadow of a cultural war loomed on the horizon. In August 1961, the police raided the Hasidic village Kamimiot, only to find out that the bird had flown the coop. Yossel had been hidden in the village a year and a half before, in December 1959, when his uncle Shalom had brought him to the home of a Mr. Zalman Kot. The child was hidden under the name Israel Hazak. In the meantime, though, the child had been whisked away, and Shalom Starks had left the country and settled in the Hasidic community Golders Green in London. On the demand of the Israeli police, Starks was arrested by the British. When his first child, Kalman, was born, his family brought the baby to the prison where the circumcision ritual was performed. But Yossel was gone, without a trace. Some believed that he had been smuggled out of the country, or even got sick and died. The police became a laughingstock. Violent clashes erupted between secular and Orthodox Jews. Yeshiva students were caught and beaten in the street by passers-by. Secular youngsters taunted Orthodox youths with the cries, "Where is Yossel?" The fury of the Israeli public reached its boiling point. Stormy debates shook the Knesset. That's when Ben-Gurion called Issa. When Issa Horel agreed to assume the search for Yossel, he didn't realize that he was accepting the most difficult and complicated assignment of his career. He never used to discuss operational matters with his wife, Rivka. But this time he told her, the authority of the government is at stake. One of his best agents, Ovrom Shalom, had a different opinion. Issa wanted to prove that he could succeed where the police had failed. The police were only too happy to palm off their unwanted task. Joseph Namias, the chief of police, asked Issa, "Do you really believe it is possible to find the child?" Amos Manor, the head of the Shabak and Issa's close collaborator, was against the entire project. Many of the Mossad and the Shabak senior officers agreed. They all thought that this assignment was outside their duties. They were supposed to work for the security of Israel, and not chase a kid in Hasidic schools. Unlike Issa, they didn't believe the Secret Service served to preserve the reputation of the Jewish state. Yet, once Issa had made up his mind, they didn't contest his decision. His authority was absolute. Issa and his assistants created a task force of about 40 agents, the best Shabak investigators, members of the operational team, religious agents or people posing as such, and even civilians who volunteered for the operation. Most of the volunteers were members of the Orthodox community who realized the danger that Yossel's abduction posed for the nation. But their first operations ended in dismal failure. They crudely tried to penetrate the ultra-Orthodox bastions and were immediately recognized, mocked, and rejected. "I felt as if I had landed on Mars," said one of Issa's agents, and had to blend in among a crowd of little green men without being noticed. Issa patiently studied the file, reading and rereading each document. There was no trace of Yossel anywhere in Israel. Issa finally reached a conclusion: the child had been taken out of the country. Out of the country, but where? A strange piece of news drew his attention. In mid-March 1962, a large group of Hasidic Jews had traveled to Israel from Switzerland. Scores of men, women, and children came to escort the coffin of their venerated rabbi and bury him in the Holy Land. Issa came to suspect that the funeral was just a cover story used to spirit Yossel out of the country when the group returned to Switzerland a few weeks later. Issa posted his men at the airport and sent a small team of his men, headed by Ovrom Shalom, to Zurich to follow the Hasidim on their return. The Mossad agents even went to the children's boarding school and snuck into its courtyard at night to peek in the windows and scrutinize every child. "We reached this yeshiva in the middle of the forest," Shalom recalled. "We stuck to the windows. We knew he might be disguised, but we looked for a child that could be of the same age." After a week of nightly adventures, he had to report to Issa that Yossel definitely was not among the Swiss children. Issa decided to assume command of the operation. He placed all pending matters into the hands of his aides, settled in an improvised headquarters in Paris, and sent his men all over the world. They carried out investigations in France, Italy, Switzerland, Belgium, England, South America, the United States, and North Africa. Using different covers, they tried to penetrate Orthodox yeshivas and communities in order to list the centers where the child could be hidden. A young Orthodox Jew from Jerusalem arrived in the famous yeshiva of Rabbi Soloveitchik in Switzerland, posing as a scholar who came to study the Torah with the renowned master. A modest religious woman, pious and devout, arrived in London, carrying warm letters of recommendation from Shalom Stark's mother-in-law, whose trust she had won. She was invited by the Starks family to stay with them as their house guest. They didn't know that the good woman was Yehudith Nisiyahu, Issa's best female agent who had participated in Eichmann's abduction. Yehudith wasn't the only Mossad agent operating in London these days. London was an important center of ultra-Orthodox Hasidim of the Satmar sect, named after the Romanian village Sutomere, where the sect had originated. Issa sent another team of agents to the Hasidim residential neighborhoods in London. Another team rushed to Ireland. During the operations in England, Issa's men had stumbled upon a young religious couple who had suddenly rented an isolated house in Ireland. The Mossad agents believed that the couple would use the house as the new hideout for Yossel, and prepared a detailed plan for the capture of the child. Hurriedly, they rented apartments and cars, smuggled equipment, prepared false documents. The operation was planned to the smallest detail. And then the failures came. The first to return home frustrated was the Ireland team. It turned out that the religious couple was indeed a religious couple. They had just decided to go on vacation to Ireland. Yehudith Nisiyahu also failed to obtain any information from the Starks family, and the young man who went to study the Holy Scriptures in Switzerland returned enlightened but empty-handed. From all over the world, negative answers poured into Issa's headquarters. The child had vanished. The worst fate awaited the team that tried to penetrate the Satmar Hasidim in London. Some young, smart yeshiva students in the Stamford Hill neighborhood immediately made the uninvited guests and confronted them, shouting, "Here come the Zionists! Come, Yossel is here!" They even called the London police. Issa's assistants had to work hard to spring their colleagues from Her Majesty's jail. One after another, Issa's most devout supporters lost hope. They told him, "Issa, it won't work. Call off the hunt. You're looking for a needle in a haystack. We won't find the child. But he didn't give up. Stubborn as a bulldog, he waved off all the doubts and complaints, and continued, obsessed by the search and confident that even against all odds he would find the child. In Paris, he summoned Yakov Koroz, the head of the Mossad station. Koroz, born in Romania, had lost his parents in the Holocaust, and had been involved in espionage and security matters since his studies at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Slim, with a clear forehead, delicate features, and eyeglasses, Koroz had the outward appearance of an intellectual. He was the former head of Tavel, Unveils, the Mossad department in charge of covert relations with foreign secret services, and had forged some of Israel's most secret and unexpected alliances. He had helped build a peripheral pact between Israel and Iran, Ethiopia, Turkey, and even Sudan, all non-Arab countries on the periphery of the Middle East. He had established close cooperation with the heads of the French, British, and German secret services. He had struck an alliance with the formidable General Oufkir, Morocco's dreaded Minister of Interior, and secretly visited Morocco's King Hassan. He had even helped the Ethiopian Emperor, Haile Selassie, crush an attempted coup by his closest aides. During an undercover mission in Algeria, he had fallen in love with a young woman, Juliette Yorel, who became his wife. Koroz, soft-spoken and deceptively polite, was a master spy in a suit and tie who had never acted as a field agent, yet he was a man of the world who spoke fluent French and English, which made him a valuable asset for Issa. Issa worked around the clock. He had rented a hotel room, but spent most of his days and nights in the apartment that he had turned into his operational headquarters. His assistants bought him a folding cot. They called it Yossel's bed, and once in a while he would collapse on it for a short nap. That lasted for months. Most of the time he was busy checking reports, writing telegrams, and talking to his men, who were dispersed all over Europe. At dawn he would leave his office and go to his hotel, where he showered, freshened up, and returned to work. On the first night, as he returned to the hotel in the wee hours, the porter flashed him an appreciative smile. This little gentleman apparently enjoyed Paris's nightlife to the full. The second night, the porter allowed himself to address a friendly wink to the gentleman. But when the nightly adventures continued in the third, and fourth, and fifth nights, the porter couldn't keep his cool anymore. When Issa returned at dawn, his eyes red from lack of sleep, his face covered with stubble, his clothes ruffled, the porter theatrically removed his hat, bowed, and declared, "My respects, monsieur." Then, one April morning, a curious report reached the Mossad agents. It had been dispatched by a young Orthodox Jew named May, who had been sent to Antwerp, Belgium. There he had become acquainted with a group of religious diamond merchants who followed old Rabbi Itzikel and considered him to be a holy man. When they wanted to solve their business disputes, they didn't seek help from the state courts, instead asked the rabbi to be the mediator and the judge, often for deals worth many millions. His word was law. Even in modern-day Europe, this particular group of merchants observed the customs of ancient times. May succeeded in penetrating the circle of the rabbi's followers and learned that during World War II they had acted as an anti-Nazi underground and had saved many Jews from the Gestapo. After the war, the group continued using the same methods and experience they had acquired as an underground organization to engage in business ventures throughout the world. The diamond merchants told May an extraordinary story about a blonde, blue-eyed Frenchwoman, a Catholic, who had been part of their organization during the war, helping them to rescue Jews from Hitler's grasp. The woman had been profoundly influenced by the rabbi's charisma. She converted to Judaism and became devoutly Orthodox, and more so, a priceless asset for the group. Her years in the underground had taught her a lot. She was bright, daring, she knew how to cover her tracks, change disguises, and use her charm as a weapon. Besides, she had an instinct for business and a keen natural intelligence. She had traveled the world on missions for the Antwerp group with her French passport. "She's a holy woman," the Antwerp Jews told May. They also told him that she had visited Israel. Her son from her first marriage, Claude, had also converted, and after studying in yeshivas in Switzerland and Aix-les-Bains, was now a student at a Talmudic school in Jerusalem. But even the Antwerp people didn't know where the fabulous holy woman was now. That story fired up Issa's imagination. On the face of it, there was nothing in the report to connect the Frenchwoman to Yossel. But in Issa's eyes, she appeared as a person with enormous potential, a woman with 1,000 faces. She could be a real godsend for the Orthodox leaders if they needed somebody to set out on secret missions concerning Yossel. Issa decided to follow his intuition, abandon all other leads, and concentrate on the mysterious convert. He cabled to Israel all the details he knew, and instructed his service to find the son and his mother. A few days later, the answer came. The son's name was now Ariel, and he was in Israel indeed. Yet nobody knew where his mother was. Her name was originally Madeleine Ferret. In Israel, she was called Ruth Ben David. The report streaming to Issa's headquarters painted a more accurate picture of Madeleine Ferret. The pretty young woman had studied history and geography at the Toulouse University and the Sorbonne in Paris. She had married her college sweetheart, Henri, and their son was born shortly after the outbreak of World War II. Madeleine had joined the Maquis resistance during the war, and her underground activities had brought her into contact with French and Belgian Jews, among them the Antwerp group. At the war's end, she even initiated joint import-export ventures with some of them. In 1951 she divorced Henri after falling in love with a young rabbi in a small Alsatian town. The rabbi, a fervent Zionist, wanted to emigrate to Israel, and the two lovers decided to marry there. Her conversion to Judaism, therefore, was not so much for love of the religion itself as for love of one of its adherents. The recently converted Ruth Ben David tied a scarf on her blonde hair, changed her elegant clothes for the shapeless vestments of an Orthodox Jewess, and followed her fiancé to the Holy Land. But in Israel the affair turned sour, the rabbi left her, and she remained alone, depressed and frustrated. Her personal crisis apparently motivated her to approach the most extremist circles in Jerusalem and their leader, Rabbi Meisish. She gained a lot of respect in the religious circles after using her French passport to cross into the Jordanian sector of Jerusalem and pray at the Wailing Wall. In the early 50s, Ruth returned to France and started traveling extensively again. The Mossad agents found out that she often stayed in Aix-les-Bains, or in a religious women's institution close to Paris. But she had no permanent address. The immigration authorities informed Issa's men that in the last few years Ruth had visited Israel twice. The second time, on June 21, 1960, she had left Israel with a little girl, who was recorded in her passport as her daughter. She had departed on an Alitalia flight, and her final destination was Zurich. But who was the small girl? Ben David had no daughter. Issa felt that he was on the right track. "Find her," he said to Yakov Karoz. Armed with a detailed description of the woman, Karoz and another agent set out for Aix-les-Bains. But as they drove into the small town, they saw something amazing. Ruth Ben David, or, in this case, Madeleine Ferret, elegantly dressed, stood by the road hitchhiking. They were startled. Elegant, refined French women trying to thumb a ride on the roads of France were not a common sight, to say the least. The driver immediately made a U-turn and darted toward the lady, but another car stopped ahead of him and departed with the pretty woman. The agents returned from Aix-les-Bains empty-handed, but from another source, they learned that Ruth Ben David kept close ties with Joseph Dom, a rich London jewel merchant. She had been sighted sitting alone with Dom in an automobile, which was inappropriate for a Hasidic man. Issa knew of Dom. He was a staunch enemy of the State of Israel. He belonged to the Satmar Hasidic sect, was a close confidant of the Satmar rabbi in New York, and knew the major Satmar leaders in various communities in Europe. If the Satmar rabbi in New York is the Pope, one expert told Issa, then Dom is his archbishop. Issa realized that all the roads led to London. Here lived the two sons of old Starks. Here was based an active community of the Satmar sect, led by Dom. Here he was seen with Ruth Ben David, who might have smuggled Yossel out of Israel. Issa had no more doubts. It had to be the Satmar Hasidim in Israel and Europe who had orchestrated the kidnapping of the child. Dom had been in charge of the operation. Ruth Ben David had been instrumental in the abduction. Because of her talents, her experience, and her French passport, she might know where the child was hidden. His suspicions were confirmed by a Shabak agent who intercepted several letters Ruth Ben David had written to her son. They contained some veiled hints about Yossel Schutzmacher. Yet Issa needed more information. He decided to penetrate the Satmar Hasidim. His men in London identified a mohel, a rabbi who specialized in the circumcision of newborn Jewish boys, named Freya, not his real name. He was a chatterbox, a man with a taste for life's pleasures under a cloak of righteousness, and, last but not least, a man who was close to Dom and claimed that he knew where Yossel was. Issa launched a complicated operation, intended to bring Freya to Paris. One of his men, posing as a Moroccan prince, came secretly to Freya and told him he had fallen in love with a Jewish girl. They had married in secret and kept the Jewish faith at home, in Morocco. Now his wife had given birth to a baby boy and he wanted him circumcised, but couldn't do it in Morocco. His family would murder him if they only knew. His wife and child were in Paris. Would Rabbi Freya come to circumcise the baby? He would be handsomely rewarded. Freya readily agreed, and a few days later arrived in Paris. The moment he stepped into the apartment of the Moroccan prince, he was apprehended by Mossad agents. They escorted him to a bare room, where he was interrogated for hours by Victor Cohen, the head of the Shabak investigation department. The mohel was scared to death, offered no resistance, and was ready to talk. But when asked about Yossel, he raised his hands. "I am dreadfully sorry," he said, "but I don't know a thing." It turned out, indeed, that Freya knew nothing about the abducted child, and all his braggadocio was just intended to impress his friends. Once again, Issa's efforts hit a wall. Surprisingly, another team of his men had struck gold. With the help of the French Secret Service, they had succeeded in intercepting several letters sent to Madeleine Faray, and in one of them they found the opportunity they were looking for. It was a reply to a newspaper offering for sale her country house in Orleans, a lovely city in the Garden of France, the Loire Valley. They dispatched a letter to the post office box given in the advertisement and offered Faray more than she was asking for her house. They claimed they were Austrian businessmen looking for a location for their vacations. Madeleine Faray answered, giving the address of her house. Soon after, they wrote to her again, saying they had visited it and it suited their needs. They fixed an appointment for closing the deal on June 21, 1962, in the lobby of a big hotel in Paris. A few days before the appointment, Issa's men arrived in Paris one by one and engaged in feverish activity. They rented cars and safe houses in Paris and its suburbs, established escape routes, prepared documents and equipment, and brought from Israel experts in surveillance and interrogation. Issa also decided that the best means to make Ruth Ben David spill her secrets was through her son. Ariel studied in a yeshiva in Israel and apparently knew a lot about Yossel. Issa decided to arrest him simultaneously with his mother's abduction in France. Ariel was orthodox, but less fanatical than his mother. Issa established a system of communication that would enable the Mossad agents to synchronize the questioning of Ruth with that of her son in Israel, so they could use the answers of the son for the questioning of the mother. And indeed, on the morning of June 21st, a tall, elegant, strikingly beautiful woman walked into the hotel lobby. This was Madeleine Ferré. The charming Frenchwoman introduced herself to the two Austrians who were waiting for her. One of them was Herr Ferber, the other Herr Schmidt. She spoke excellent English, and also had a good command of German. She never suspected the identity of her two buyers. They quickly reached an agreement about the sale of the house, but their lawyer was late. Ferber called him from one of the hotel phone booths. When he came back, he said that the lawyer had profusely apologized. He had been detained at home, he said, by several urgent matters. He had asked if they could come to his house in the town of Chantilly, close to the city, and gave Ferber the address and detailed directions. He would receive them immediately and they would sign all the papers on the spot. "Shall we go?" Ferber asked. Madeleine agreed. They got into the two Austrians' rental car and drove to the lawyer's villa. But the Frenchwoman's charm almost caused the failure of the entire operation. Ferber, the agent at the wheel, was so entranced by Madeleine that he went through a red light. The strident shriek of a whistle brought him back to reality. A fat, angry police officer was running toward him, blowing his whistle and pointing to the red light. Ferber stopped the car, fraught by ominous premonitions. What should he do? He was in a foreign country, with phony papers, driving a rented car with a woman who was about to disappear. He would get a traffic ticket, a procedure against him would be initiated by the police, But Madeleine Ferré, who had caused all his troubles, was also the one who came to his rescue. She stuck her head out of the window, and flashed a charming smile at the police officer. "Monsieur l'agent," she said sweetly, "this man is a tourist. He is in a foreign country, travels with a woman, and tries to amuse her with his stories. You certainly can understand that. Please forgive him." The police officer, too, was entranced by the lady's charm, and let the panic-stricken agents off without even writing a ticket. Presently the car entered the beautiful town of Chantilly, where the lawyer lived. They entered the villa's driveway and stopped before the main entrance. The two businessmen politely helped their guest out of the car, escorted her to the house, the door opened, and she walked in. She was led to the lawyer's office. The part of the lawyer was played by Yakov Karoz. "Madam," he said in French, "you are not here to discuss your house in Orleans, but another matter." "What? What's going on?" "I want to talk to you about the child Yossel Schutzmacher." At that moment, two other men materialized at her side. When she turned back, she realized that the two businessmen had vanished without a trace. She was struck with fear. "I've fallen into a trap," she hoarsely whispered in French. "You've fallen in the hands of the Israeli services, madam," Karoz said. At that very moment, police officers arrested Ariel Ben David, the Frenchwoman's son, in the town of Bir Yaakov, in Israel. In Chantilly, Karoz turned to Ruth Ben David. "Madam, you are involved in the abduction of Yossel Schutzmacher. We want the child." "I know nothing and I'll say nothing," she answered firmly. After the initial shock, she had recovered quickly. Karoz had brought over his sister-in-law, a trained nurse, to stand by in case of emergency. The Israelis understood that Ruth was their last hope. But they also assumed that this Iron Lady would not break easily, and that might take quite a while. She was handed over to Yehudith Nisiyahu, who had arrived from London. Nisiyahu treated her well and took care of her needs as a religious woman. She provided her with prayer books and candles for the Sabbath. She cooked kosher food for her. The wing where she was kept was out of bounds for men. The nurse occupied the room next to hers. The interrogation started. The convert spent hours facing the agents, mostly Yakov Kuraz and Victor Cohen, who addressed her in French. She was amazed to discover that the Israelis knew all about her, but she stubbornly refused to reveal any information about Yossel. "I'll say nothing," she kept repeating. She called Victor Cohen Flick, which in French slang means cop. She stubbornly denied any connection with the abduction. "So I started to talk to her about all kinds of subjects," Victor Cohen recalled later, just to soften her. "I wanted to understand how a Christian girl had become a fanatical Orthodox. These are two different worlds. At first, when we spoke, she insisted that there had to be another woman in the room with us. Later she agreed to sit alone with me, but the door had to remain open." One of her interrogators was charged with the unpleasant duty of throwing insulting accusations in her face, in order to make her lose her calm. The Mossad men hoped that she would react impulsively, and blurt out things she didn't mean to say. They could be used in the simultaneous interrogation of her son in Israel. And indeed, the interrogation of Ariel Ben David started bearing fruit. The chief investigator in Israel was Ovrom Hadar, a tough guy incongruously codenamed Parshosh, Thrush. He told the young man that his mother had capitulated. "Your mother has confessed to everything," he said. "Your lies will get you nowhere. Tell the truth." And after a while Ariel broke down. He said he knew what had happened to the child, and would talk only if my mother and I get immunity. Parshosh told him, "You got it." He immediately brought Ariel to Amos Manor, the head of the Shabak. As they entered, Manor yelled at Ariel, "Whatever Parshosh promised you, I agree. Now, where is the child?" Ariel was shaken. He finally admitted that his mother had smuggled Yossel out of Israel, disguised as a little girl. She had forged her passport, where he had been registered under his former name, Claude. She had changed the name to Claudine, and also changed the birth date, so it could fit Yossel's age. He knew that the child had been taken to Switzerland. Ariel's confession was rushed to Chantilly, and Ruth Ben David's interrogators confronted her with the new facts. "Ariel is in our hands, Victor," Cohen told her. "He is facing stiff punishment. He has confessed everything. Don't you care what will happen to your son?" "He is not my son anymore," she muttered. She remained unbreakable. The interrogators couldn't help admiring the tremendous strength of that woman. Gradually, the situation became untenable. The solution seemed so close, and yet the interrogators felt that everything might end in total failure. Finally, Issa decided the time had come for him to take over. In the bare, dark room, Issa Horel and Ruth Ben David faced each other across the table. Some Mossad agents stood behind them. Cohen and Kuraz served as interpreters. Issa firmly believed that this fiercely determined woman would not yield to any threats. The only way, he thought, was to convince her with moral arguments. She was religious, indeed, but she would listen to logic. After all, she had not been an ultra-Orthodox Jewess all her life, and the fanaticism of former generations didn't flow in her veins since her birth. She was an intelligent, shrewd woman, and she should be addressed as such. "I represent the Israeli government," Issa said, weighing every word. "Your son has told us everything, and we have a lot of other information about you. Most of your secrets are known to us. We are sorry that we had to bring you here by force. You converted to Judaism, and Judaism means Israel. Without Israel, Judaism would not survive. The abduction of Yossel has dealt a terrible blow to the religious community in Israel. It stirred feelings of fury against the Orthodox. You could be the cause of bloodshed and a civil war. If you don't return the child, a blood libel may result. Just think what might happen to that child. He could get sick, even die. How could you and your accomplices face his parents then? That would haunt you for the rest of your lives. And you'll never be absolved. You are a woman and a mother. If someone disapproved of the way you're bringing up your son and took him away from you, how would you feel? Could you sleep at night? We are not fighting against religion. Our only purpose is to find the child. As soon as we have him in our hands, you'll go free, your son will go free, and Israel will be united again. Issa watched as Ruth's face began to show her inner conflict. She seemed torn by contradictory feelings. Ruth was in a state of high tension, fighting against herself as only a strong person can before an uncompromising dilemma. The Mossad agents were motionless like statues. They, too, believed that the moment of truth had arrived. Ruth raised her head. How do I know that you are a genuine representative of the State of Israel? How can I trust you? Without a blink, Issa pulled out his diplomatic passport, issued in his real name, and handed it to Ruth Ben-David. His men were dumbfounded. Has he gone mad? To give her his name and passport, that was a tremendous risk. Issa, however, felt that only if he showed her he was sincere and had confidence in her did he have a chance of success. For a long moment Ruth gazed at the seal of Israel embossed on the passport. She bit her lips till drops of blood popped on her mouth. I can't take it anymore, she murmured. I am going to break down. Then, suddenly, she raised her head. The child is with the Gertner family, 126 Penn Street, Brooklyn, New York. They call him Yankali. Issa jumped to his feet. As soon as we get the child, you'll be free. He left the room. A feverish exchange of telegrams alerted Jerusalem, then New York and Washington. Issa called Israel Geori, the security officer of the Israeli diplomatic missions in North America. Geori, who was based in New York, checked the Brooklyn address. He cabled back that the address was correct and that the Gertner family lived in a district largely populated by Satmar Hasidim. Jerusalem dispatched a cable to Avram Haman, Israel's ambassador in Washington, instructing him to contact the FBI and ask them to find the child and deliver him to Israel. Geori himself called his counterpart at the FBI and gave him all the details, what the child eats, what he wears, etc. The FBI agent answered, if you know so much about him, go get him yourself. Geori replied, give me the authorization. The FBI agent refused. Disquieting telegrams began pouring into Issa's headquarters. The Americans are hesitating, Geori and the Israeli ambassador reported. They ask, are you absolutely certain that the child is at that address? What would happen if we raided that house and didn't find the child? The FBI hinted that their reticence was due to the upcoming congressional elections. The Satmar sect controlled almost 100,000 votes, and the administration didn't want to risk alienating them. In Chantilly, Issa was losing patience. At midnight, he picked up the phone. Get me Harmon in Washington, he ordered. When the connection was established, he was blunt. Harmon, he said, this is Issa Horrell. I want you to get in touch with Attorney General Robert Kennedy immediately and tell him in my name that the FBI should get the boy at once." Harmon was stunned. "Issa, how can you talk like that?" He hinted that the American services might be monitoring their conversation. "So much the better," Issa said. "I am not talking only to you." He hoped that the Americans were listening in, and his firm stand would rouse them to action. Harmon kept hesitating and tried to warn Issa about possible diplomatic complications. "I didn't ask your opinion," Issa snapped. "Tell them that if they don't act immediately, they will be held responsible for anything that happens." A few hours later, Issa was called to the telephone. It was New York. The consulate officials informed him that Robert Kennedy had taken immediate action. A team of FBI agents, accompanied by the Israeli security officer, had gone to Brooklyn. The child was indeed found and taken to a safe place. It was Yossel. A young reporter named Elie Wiesel, the future Nobel Prize winner, called Geori. "I heard that you found the child." Geori, who had been sworn to secrecy, firmly denied. Wiesel didn't forgive him for years. The 4th of July 1962 was a national holiday in Israel as well, as on that day the plane carrying Yossel home landed at Lod Airport. The press enthusiastically praised the dedicated efficiency of the Secret Service. Israel was fast becoming the only country in the world where that shadow organization was loved and admired by the whole nation. A well-known Israeli lawyer, Shlomo Cohen-Zidon, wrote a letter of thanks to Ben-Gurion for finding the child. Ben-Gurion wrote back, "You should thank our secret services and mostly their head, who spent days and nights on that mission, and didn't rest, even when his assistants almost gave up, till he found the child and pulled him out of his hideout, which was not easy either." While all of Israel was celebrating Yossel's rescue, Issa was in Paris, where his men threw a modest party for him. One of the agents raised his glass to the child returned to his fatherland, to the iron-willed man who found him, to the state that knows so well to protect its citizens. Another agent presented Issa with a stuffed toy tiger cub as a souvenir of the operation. His colleagues shipped to his home in Tel Aviv Yossel's bed, on which he had passed so many sleepless nights. Now that the boy had been found, the whole truth came to light. It had all started with a telegram. In the spring of 1960, while Yossel was being clandestinely shuttled from one yeshiva to another in Israel, Ruth Ben David received a telegram from her friend Rabbi Meizish, "Come immediately to Jerusalem, I have a good match for you." When Ruth arrived, she found out that the match was actually a secret mission to smuggle Yossel out of Israel. Ruth returned to France, altered her passport, changing the name of her son from Claude to Claudine and his date of birth from 1945 to 1953. She then changed her clothes and her name, becoming Madeleine Ferret. She flew to Genoa and bought a passage on a ship that sailed to Israel carrying passengers and new immigrants. On Genoa's dock, she began to play, as if by chance, with the 8-year-old daughter of a family of immigrants. When the boarding began, and the immigrants were struggling with their packages and suitcases, the charming Madeleine took the little girl by the hand and led her up to the ship's deck. The Italian immigration officers checked her passport and noted that she had got on board with her little girl. In Israel, she repeated the same procedure, and the Israeli immigration duly noted that she had come out of the boat with her little daughter. A few days later, Madeleine Ferret boarded a plane at Lod Airport with her daughter Claudine, who was none other than Yossel Schutzmacher, wearing a neat girl's dress and patent leather pumps. Yossel spent almost 2 years in ultra-Orthodox boarding schools in Switzerland and France. But when the search for Yossel in Israel reached a larger scale, Madeleine showed up at the boarding school in Mo, where the child was hidden now under the guise of Munekim, an orphan of Swiss parentage. She dressed him in girl's clothes once again and flew with him to America. There she was helped by the head of the Satmar sect, Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, who directed a milkman named Gertner to take Yankee to his home and pass him off as a cousin from Argentina who had come for a long visit. The Mossad experts realized that the ultra-Orthodox clandestine network spread all over America and Europe was comparable to the secret organizations of the world's best intelligence services. And, most of all, they were amazed by Ruth Ben David. She stuck to the rules of conspiracy. She never had a permanent address, carried all her important papers in her handbag, changed identities as easily as one changes one's clothes. The lovely Frenchwoman was the Mata Hari of the Orthodox world. But while all of Israel was rejoicing over the return of Yossel to his parents, Ruth Ben David felt broken and vanquished. "I am guilty," she said to her friends, sobbing. "I betrayed our cause. I can never forgive myself. I had a precious treasure entrusted to me, and I could not keep it." Yet Madeleine Ferrer Ruth Ben David had so admirably demonstrated all the qualities necessary for a secret agent that Issa Horel decided to offer her a job at the Mossad. But he was too late. Ruth returned to Jerusalem and vanished in the ultra-Orthodox world. 3 years later, she married Rabbi Amram Blau, the 72-year-old head of the most fanatical of all sects, Neturei Karta. Issa Horel and Yossel Schutzmacher met only 9 years later, when one of the authors of this book threw a party in Issa's honor and invited Yossel. Yossel, now a private first class in a tank division, shook hands with Issa and declared, "I am deeply touched. Issa Horel has been the most important person in my life. Without him I would not be here among you." Episode 8. A Nazi hero at the service of the Mossad. On a stifling hot day in August 1963, 2 men entered the offices of an engineering company in Madrid and asked to meet the owner, an Austrian by the name of Otto Skorzeny. They introduced themselves to Skorzeny as NATO intelligence officers and told him they had come on the recommendation of his estranged wife. They had for him an offer he couldn't refuse. Very soon, the respectable businessman realized that his visitors knew all about him and his past. During World War II, SS officer Skorzeny had been one of the great heroes, if not the greatest, of Nazi Germany. A tall, charismatic athlete, his face scarred in a fencing duel, he had become a daredevil commando officer who carried out spectacular operations. On September 12, 1943, he had landed, with a paratrooper battalion carried by gliders, on top of the Gran Sasso, the highest peak in the Italian Apennines, and stormed the Campo Imperata Hotel, where former fascist dictator Benito Mussolini had been jailed by a new, anti-Nazi Italian government. SS Captain Skorzeny rescued Mussolini and brought him to a grateful Hitler, who showered Skorzeny with medals and promotions. In the Battle of the Bulge, in late 1944, Skorzeny, now a Waffen SS colonel, snuck through the front lines with 24 of his men, dressed as American soldiers, and caused disorder and confusion in the Allied ranks. His operations earned him the reputation of the most dangerous man in Europe. Found not guilty at the Dachau trials after the war, he moved to Spain where he enjoyed the protection of fascist dictator Franco, and established his company. His visitors that day in 1963 didn't waste time on small talk. "We are not exactly from NATO," one of them admitted in perfect German. "Actually, we belong to the Israeli secret services." The 2 men were Rafi Eitan and the head of the Mossad station in Germany, Avrom Haitov. Skorzeny paled. Barely a year ago, the Israelis had hanged Adolf Eichmann. Were they after him now? He had been cleared at the war trials, but some claimed that he had taken part in burning Jewish synagogues during Kristallnacht in November 1938. But the short man sitting in front of him dispelled his fears. "We need your help," he said. "We know you have good connections in Egypt." He then proceeded to tell the SS colonel why the Jewish state needed his assistance. On July 21, 1962, only 2 weeks after the triumphant return of Yossel to Israel, Egypt amazed the world by launching 4 missiles. 2 were of the Al-Zafar, the Victor, type, with a range of 175 miles, and 2 of the Al-Qahir, the Conqueror, type, with a range of 350 miles. The huge missiles, draped in Egypt's flags, were proudly paraded in the streets of Cairo on Revolution Day, July 23. President Gamal Abdel Nasser boasted to an ecstatic crowd that his missiles were capable of hitting any target south of Beirut. South of Beirut, Israel's leaders were seized with astonishment and anxiety. Nasser's missiles could indeed hit any target in Israel. That came as a complete surprise to Israel, and in the corridors of power angry words were addressed to Issa Horel. While Nasser was building his deadly rockets, the critics said, little Issa was busy chasing Yossel. While terrible dangers threatened the very existence of the Jewish state, Issa's best agents were running from one yeshiva to another, disguised as ultra-Orthodox Jews. A worried Ben-Gurion summoned Issa Horel, who promised to get all the information about the Egyptian project as soon as possible. Back at his headquarters, Issa sent his best men on a mission, and activated his moles and informants in Egypt. And indeed, on August 16, less than a month after the launching of the 4 missiles, he came back to Ben-Gurion with a detailed report. The missiles were being built by German scientists, Issa reported. In 1959, Nasser had decided to establish a secret arsenal of unconventional weapons. He had appointed General Mahmoud Khalil, a former Air Force intelligence commander, head of the Bureau for Special Military Programs, to develop these ultra-secret modern weapons, jet fighters, rockets, and missiles, as well as chemical and radioactive substances. The Bureau was allotted a huge budget. Khalil's first task was to find the men to make these weapons a reality. And he knew where to look. His agent started to recruit hundreds of German experts and scientists, most of whom had been employed in the rocket and aviation research institutes and testing grounds of Nazi Germany. More than 300 Germans, tempted by high salaries, bonuses, and myriad privileges, clandestinely trickled into Egypt and helped Nasser build 3 secret installations. The first was Factory 36, where genius aircraft builder Willy Messerschmitt was assembling an Egyptian jet fighter. Messerschmitt was the father of the deadly fighter planes of the Luftwaffe, the Nazi Air Force, during World War II. Mahmoud Khalil had signed a contract with him on November 29, 1959. In the second plant, known by the code 135, an engineer named Ferdinand Brandner was building jet engines for Messerschmitt's aircraft. Brandner had spent several years in Russia. After his return to Germany, Khalil had got in touch with him with the help of Dr. Eckert, a director of Daimler-Benz. But the most secret was Factory 333, hidden in a remote area in the desert. There, Hitler's former Wunderkinds now built Nasser's wonder weapons, the intermediate-range missiles. According to Issa's sources, the Egyptian project had shifted to high gear in December 1960. That month, an American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft had photographed a huge building site in Dimona, Israel, that seemed to be a nuclear reactor. The world press announced the discovery with banner headlines. Nobody believed Israel's stilted statements that the structure was a textile factory. Egypt and several other Arab nations issued furious threats against Israel. But threats were not enough, and Egypt hoped to neutralize Israel's secret nuclear project by developing its own unconventional weapons. The head of the German rocket scientists in Egypt was Professor Eugen Sanger, the director of the Institute of Research on Jet Propulsion in Stuttgart. After the war, Sanger had spent a few years in France, where he built the Veronique rocket, a mediocre replica of the German VR-2 rocket. He came to Egypt with his assistants, Professor Paul Go-Erk, an electronics and guidance expert, and Wolfgang Pils, formerly an engineer at the Piemont installation, where the brilliant Wernher von Braun had developed Nazi Germany's VE-2 rockets. Another guidance and control expert closely collaborating with his colleagues in Egypt was Dr. Hans Kleinwachter, whose lab for developing missile guidance systems was in the picturesque German city of Lörrach, close to the Swiss border. The chemistry department was headed by Dr. Ermin Dadju, a former SS officer. The Germans and the Egyptians established several front companies, Intra-Handel, Patwag, and Linda, that purchased parts and materials for the missile project. The administrative director of Intra-Handel was Dr. Heinz Krug, who also managed the Institute for Jet Propulsion in Stuttgart. Hassan Kamil, an Egyptian millionaire living in Switzerland, was also enlisted as a facade and liaison man. With his help, the Egyptians established 2 dummy companies in Switzerland, MECO, Mechanical Corporation, and MTP, Motors, Turbines, and Pumps, whose task was to acquire basic materials, electrical apparatuses, and precision tools. They also recruited specialists and experts. The 3 directors of these companies were Messerschmitt, Brandner, and Kamil. In 1961, Sanger and many hundreds of engineers, technicians, and local Egyptian employees had started building the Egyptian missiles. But at the end of that year, the German government discovered the secret connection between the Egyptian project and the Institute for Jet Propulsion in Stuttgart. The German authorities forced Sanger to resign, return to Germany, and cease all activity. Professor Pils succeeded him as head of the Egyptian project. By July 1962, Factory 333 produced 30 missiles. 4 of them were launched with great fanfare before a select crowd of government guests and journalists. 20 others, some of them dummies, draped with the Egyptian flag, were paraded through Cairo's streets. When Issa Horel came to Ben Gurion in August, he produced a letter from Pils to Kamil Azab, the Egyptian director of 333, which Rofi Eitan and his men had succeeded in copying. It was a request for 3,700,000 Swiss francs for machine parts and other equipment needed for building 500 missiles of Type 2 and 400 missiles of Type 5. 900 missiles. Issa's report caused deep anxiety in the defense community. The Israeli experts were certain that the Egyptians had no intention of loading the missiles' warheads with conventional explosives. They wouldn't have spent millions of dollars building them merely for the missiles to carry a half-ton of dynamite. A bomber could do that with more precision. It was clear that Egypt would load the warheads with atomic bombs or some other substance forbidden by international law, such as poison gas, bacterial cultures, or deadly radioactive waste. According to Issa, the German scientists were working on a devious plan to destroy Israel. They were developing doomsday weapons, huge missiles, radioactive warheads that could kill any living thing, and poison the air in Israel for many years. They were even working on death rays and other kinds of hellish contraptions. We took them too seriously, General Zvi Zer, the chief of staff at the time, admitted later. Our scientists were amateurs and didn't know how to handle the information. Still, the Israelis discovered the Achilles heel of the Egyptian project. The Germans hadn't succeeded yet in developing a proper guidance system to direct the missiles to their targets. As long as that obstacle wasn't overcome, the missiles couldn't be used. Issa Horel was no longer the same man his people knew and admired. Since Eichmann's capture, he had undergone a profound change. This cool-headed man, who was known for his nerves of steel, now regarded Germany as the eternal enemy of Israel and the Jewish people. He staunchly believed that the current German government was supporting the scientists in Egypt and secretly helping them in their efforts to destroy Israel. The Ramsad asked Ben Gurion to alert Germany's Chancellor Konrad Adenauer and demand that he act immediately to stop the scientists' activities. Ben Gurion refused. Quite recently, Germany had given Israel a huge loan of $500 million to develop the Negev desert. Ben-Gurion and Adenauer had established personal relations of trust and mutual respect. Adenauer and his Minister of Defense Franz Joseph Strauss supplied Israel with huge quantities of modern weapons worth hundreds of millions of dollars, tanks, cannons, helicopters, aircraft, all of this for free, in a secret effort to atone for the Holocaust and Germany's crimes against the Jewish people. Ben-Gurion trusted the current German government and didn't want to jeopardize Israel's relations with it by hurling accusations and demands to intervene in the Egyptian crisis. He instructed Deputy Minister of Defense Shimon Peres to write a personal letter to Strauss and discreetly ask for his help. But this wasn't enough for Issa, who decided to launch his own all-out campaign to disrupt the Germans' activities in Egypt. On September 11, 1962, at 10:30 a.m., a swarthy stranger with a Middle Eastern cast to his features entered the intra-offices on Munich's Schillerstrasse. The clerk who ushered him into the office of the company director, Dr. Heinz Krug, heard him say he had been sent by Colonel Nadim, an Egyptian officer who maintained close contacts with Krug. Half an hour later, the Egyptian left the building with Krug. A United Arab Airlines stewardess saw the two men go by the airline ticket office. She was the last person to see Krug. The following morning, Mrs. Krug informed the police that her husband was missing. 2 days later, the police found Krug's white Mercedes abandoned on the outskirts of Munich. The car was covered with mud, and its tank was bone dry. An anonymous phone call to the police announced, "Dr. Krug is dead." But some information from other sources made the police believe that Krug had been abducted by Mossad agents and taken to Israel. Today, there is no more doubt that Krug is dead. On November 27, Hannelore Wendy, Pill's secretary at Factory 333, saw a thick envelope in the morning mail. The sender was a well-known Hamburg lawyer. Hannelore opened the package. A deafening explosion shook the office. Gravely wounded, Pill's secretary was taken to the hospital, where she was to spend a few months before leaving blind, deaf, her face badly scarred. The next day, a big package marked books arrived at Factory 333. When an Egyptian clerk opened it, the package exploded, killing 5 people. The sender's address, a Stuttgart publisher, turned out to be false. The explosive packages kept arriving the following days. Some of them had been sent from Germany, others from inside Egypt. Some blew up, causing casualties, others were defused by Egyptian army experts alerted by 333 officials. The identity of the senders wasn't officially established, but the Egyptians and the journalists were certain that the bombs were prepared and sent to Cairo by the Israeli Mossad. Much later, it was established that several of the letter bombs had been mailed by the Champagne spy. This was an Israeli agent, Zeev Geori, who operated in Egypt under the cover of Wolfgang Lutz, a German owner of a horse farm near Cairo. Posing as a former SS officer, he had settled in Cairo with his German wife and established close relations with Egypt's high society and its military leaders. The letter bombs deeply disturbed the German scientists, who now felt their lives were in danger. Many of them got anonymous phone calls threatening them or their families if they kept working on NASA's project. Strict security measures were applied at the 3 factories in Egypt and at the sister companies in Europe. When visiting Europe, the scientists had to move in large groups, accompanied by German security officers. This practice probably saved Professor Pills on his trip to Europe in late 1962. A group of strangers followed him in Germany and Italy, but didn't get the opportunity to come near him. Issa spent the fall and winter of 1962 in Europe, directing several Mossad operations intended to obtain more accurate and updated information. Rafi Eitan succeeded in penetrating a diplomatic mission that handled the German scientists' mail. Such operations were his favorite. "That's much better than recruiting agents," he said. "When you recruit an agent, you have to train him, build him a foolproof cover, put him in place, and give him time to establish contacts. But reading your enemy's mail is much better. You get immediate results and first-class material." For his unconventional operations, Aton needed some very sophisticated electronic equipment, but did not know where to get it. The equipment, used by the CIA and other intelligence agencies, could not be found in stores. While reading his newspaper in his Paris office, Aton noticed a short item about the notorious Jewish mobster Meyer Lansky, who was the mob boss of Miami. In his scheming mind, that seemed like an opportunity. He called the operator, "Find Meyer Lansky in Miami." 3 minutes later, Lansky was on the line. "Shalom, Meyer," Aton said. "I am an Israeli, operating in Paris, and I need your help for the Zionist state." "No problem," Lansky answered. "In a month I shall be in Lausanne, in Switzerland. Let's meet there." Aton met with Lansky in Lausanne and told him what he needed. Lansky gave him the address of a certain man in Chicago. "He'll get you what you want," he said. A week later, Aton landed in Chicago and headed for the man's address. "The electronic equipment we got from this guy served us well all through our operations against the German scientists," Aton summed up. One of these operations brought a new name to Issa Horel, Dr. Otto Jocklick. According to the source material, Jocklick was an Austrian scientist specializing in nuclear radiation. Dr. Jocklick was allegedly employed by a top-secret Egyptian project to obtain nuclear weapons in record time. The Egyptians intended to establish a front company, Austria, for Jocklick in Austria, which would purchase radioactive materials for Jocklick's project and ship them to Egypt. Austria would be separate from Intra, to avoid being investigated by the German authorities. Jocklick was to carry out 2 nuclear tests for Egypt and produce several atom bombs that would be fitted into the missiles' warheads. All this indicated that Jocklick was a very dangerous man, perhaps the most dangerous of the German scientists. An urgent order was sent to all the Mossad stations in Europe: "Find Jocklick." But Issa was in for a stunning surprise. On October 23, 1962, a stranger rang the door of an Israeli embassy in Europe and asked to see the security officer. "My name is Otto Jocklick. I am ready to give you a full report about my activity for the Egyptian war effort." 2 weeks later, in utter secrecy, Jocklick landed in Israel. Many months later, when the Jocklick defection came to light, European reporters wrote that Jocklick probably contacted the Israelis because of the disappearance of Intra director Heinz Krug. Jocklick had maintained close contact with Krug, who was among the few in the know of Jocklick's role in Egypt's special military programs. When Krug disappeared, Jocklick panicked. What if Krug had been abducted by the Israelis? He might talk and reveal Jocklick's secret tasks. And then, Jocklick knew he was as good as dead. Therefore, he decided to cross the lines and surrender to the Israelis. That way, he hoped, he at least would save his life. Jocklick spent for days in Israel. He was kept in strict isolation in a top-security facility of the Mossad. Issa decided to use him for 2 main tasks: as a source of intelligence about the Egyptian project and as a double agent who would return to Egypt and work there for the Mossad. Otto Jocklick told the Israelis that he had been recruited by a senior German clerk in the United Arab Airlines who introduced him to General Mahmoud Khalil, nicknamed by the German scientists Herr Dr. Mahmoud. His meeting with the Herr Doctor resulted in 2 projects, Ibis and Cleopatra. The secret of those projects was shared only with Professor Pills and Dr. Krug. Operation Ibis was to provide Egypt with a radiological weapon that could spread dangerous nuclear radiation. Joklik took it upon himself to obtain large quantities of radioactive isotope cobalt-60 and to experiment with it in Egypt. If the experiment succeeded, Joklik would try getting more cobalt, which would be placed in the missile's warheads and spread deadly radiation on impact. The goal of the second project, Cleopatra, was to produce 2 atomic bombs. Joklik suggested an ingenious method for manufacturing the bombs, buying uranium enriched to 20% in the United States or in Europe, enriching it up to 90% by special centrifuges developed in Germany and Holland by the scientists Dr. Wilhelm Groth, Dr. Jacob Kistemaker, and Dr. Gernot Zippy, and building the bomb with the enriched uranium. Joklik flew to the United States and tried to get the enriched uranium there. He also met with several German scientists and invited them to build centrifuges in Egypt. Simultaneously, he purchased some cobalt-60 in Europe and dispatched it to a gynecologist in Cairo, whose name was Dr. Khalil, the sister of Herr Dr. Mahmoud. When Joklik's debriefing in Israel was over, his testimony was sent to several experts for review and assessment. For some reason, their reports didn't get the proper attention. Concerning the Cleopatra project, the experts said there were almost no chances that Joklik would get 20% enriched uranium. Even if he did, Egypt would need at least 100 of the best centrifuges in order to harvest the necessary uranium for assembling one bomb within 2 to 3 years. And even if they managed to build a bomb, it wouldn't go off, for Joklik's formulas were incorrect. The experts dismissed IBIS and the radiological weapons, whose impact, they said, would cause no more damage than an ordinary bomb. The soothing tone of the reports didn't calm the nation's leadership. They were even more alarmed by the reports that the Egyptians were also developing chemical weapons. On January 11, 1963, their fears were justified when the Egyptians used poison gas in their war in Yemen. Israeli Minister of Foreign Affairs Golda Meir met with President John F. Kennedy and talked to him about the danger that the Egyptians would arm their missiles with unconventional warheads. She asked him to intervene, but Kennedy did not. The unconventional warheads were indeed very dangerous, but the first priority was given to disrupting the development of the missile's guidance systems. In the winter of 1963, the Factory 333 guidance expert, Dr. Kleinwachter, was spending some weeks in Germany. On the evening of February 20th, he left his lab in Lorach and drove his car to the narrow lane leading to his home. The lane was dark and deserted, covered with deep snow. Suddenly, in a shrieking of tires, a car emerged from a cross street and blocked the way. A man got out of the car and walked toward Kleinwachter. The scientist glimpsed a third man in the car. "Where does Dr. Schenker live?" the man demanded. Without waiting for a reply, he drew a revolver equipped with a silencer and fired. The bullet shattered the windshield and lodged in the scientist's woolen muffler. Kleinwachter groped in the glove compartment for his own revolver, but his assailant ran back to a second car, which darted out of sight. The police found the first car abandoned about 100 yards from the scene of the attack. The 3 men had made their escape with another car. They had left behind a passport in the name of Ali Samir, one of the heads of the Egyptian Secret Service. It turned out, however, that this was a red herring. On the day of the attack, Samir was in Cairo and had been photographed with a German journalist. The men who had attacked Kleinwachter were never found. Yet the unanimous opinion of the press was that the assassination attempt had been carried out by the Israelis and had ended in failure. A few weeks later, the Mossad tried again, this time going after German-born Dr. Paul Goerck in Switzerland. Goerck, like Kleinwachter, was working on a guidance system for the Egyptian missiles in his lab at Factory 333. He was deemed very important by the Egyptians, and by the Mossad as well. His daughter Heidi lived in Freiburg, a German town close to the Swiss border. Shortly after the attempt on Kleinwachter's life, Dr. Joklik called Heidi and told her that he had met her father in Egypt, where he was working on the development of terrible weapons intended to destroy Israel. Joklik hinted that if Goerk didn't cease his activities, he would be exposing himself to frightful risks. If, on the other hand, he were to leave Egypt, he would not be harmed. "If you love your father," Joklik concluded, "come on Saturday, March 2nd, at 4 p.m., to the Three Kings Hotel in Basel, and I will introduce you to one of my friends." Heidi, scared, immediately contacted H-Man, a former Nazi officer who had been charged by the Egyptians with the scientist's security. Mann alerted the Freiburg police, who notified the Swiss authorities. And so, when Joklik and his friend entered the Three Kings Hotel, several police cars were waiting behind the building, detectives were stationed in the lobby, and tape recorders were installed close to the table where Heidi Goerk was sitting. Joklik and his friend, Mossad agent Joseph Bengal, walked right into the trap. They suspected nothing, and talked with Heidi Goerk for an hour, careful not to make any direct threats, but alluding to the danger for her father if he kept building his terrible weapons. They offered Heidi a plane ticket to Cairo so that she could persuade her father to return to Germany, where he and his family would be safe. The meeting over, the two men left the hotel and took the 6 o'clock train to Zurich, where they went their separate ways. But while Joklik was waiting for another train on the platform, he was arrested by plainclothes policemen. Bengal was apprehended near the Israeli consulate. That evening, the German police asked the Swiss to extradite the two men who were suspected of threatening Heidi Goerk and also of having participated in the attack on Dr. Kleinwachter. From his headquarters in Europe, Issa activated his contacts and tried to persuade the Swiss to release Bengal and Joklik, but they refused because of the German extradition request. Issa then flew back to Israel and met with Minister of Foreign Affairs Golda Meir. Lately, they had become very close and shared the same hostility and suspicions toward Germany. Golda suggested that Israel approach Chancellor Adenauer and demand that West Germany withdraw the extradition request. Issa immediately drove to Tiberias, where Prime Minister Ben-Gurion was vacationing. He urged Ben-Gurion to send a special envoy to Bonn, West Germany's capital. The envoy would present Adenauer with proof of the atrocious activities of the German scientists in Egypt and demand the withdrawal of the extradition request. Ben-Gurion refused. Issa didn't let go. "You have to decide what to do if the arrest is made public. Then the entire affair will blow up." "What do you mean, blow up?" Ben-Gurion asked. As soon as Bengal's arrest becomes known, the entire affair of the German scientists in Egypt will also come to light. Israel will have to explain why Bengal acted as he did. We shall also have to disclose that the Egyptians have been buying equipment for their rockets and other military projects from Germany. Ben-Gurion thought a moment and finally said, "So be it." That was the beginning of the rift between the two men. In the evening of Thursday, March 15, 1963, United Press International announced the arrest of Joklik and Bengal on suspicion of having threatened the daughter of a German scientist in the employ of Egypt. Issa Horel called a secret meeting with the editors-in-chief of the daily newspapers. At the meeting, he described the background to Bengal's arrest. He particularly stressed Joklik's part in the affair, the kind of work he had been doing for the Egyptian project, and the fact that he changed sides voluntarily and was trying to repair the damage. During the next few days, Issa's aide secretly briefed 3 Israeli journalists, Naftali Lavi of Haaretz, Shmuel Segev of Ma'ariv, and Yeshayahu Ben-Porat of Yedioth Ahronoth. They were given all the facts, and the addresses of Intra, Patwag, and the Stuttgart Institute. The 3 men then left for Europe to gather data on the German scientists and cable it to their papers in Israel. News about the German scientists' project would be more credible coming from Europe, Issa thought. Other Mossad men were sent abroad to brief pro-Israeli journalists. Issa Horel didn't realize that the German issue was one of the most sensitive topics in Israel. His unbridled attack on Germany started an avalanche that couldn't be stopped, a deluge of accusations against the scientists that provoked real panic in Israel. By March 17, the Israeli and foreign press were floundering in a sea of sensational headlines. German scientists, most of them former Nazis, were producing deadly weapons in Egypt. They were preparing biological, chemical, nuclear, and radioactive weapons. They were developing poison gas, terrible germs, death rays, warheads equipped with atomic bombs or radioactive waste that would spread lethal radiation. The newspapers competed with one another by publishing reports that seemed plagiarized from the Flash Gordon comics, the death ray, hissing and scorching everything in its path. The air over Israel that would be poisoned for 90 years at least. The germs spreading atrocious plagues, etc. The campaign also accused the government of the Federal Republic of Germany of refraining from putting an end to the devilish activities of its subjects working for Egypt, and actually following in Hitler's footsteps. The reporters sent to Europe added more fat to the fire by discovering every day new details about the scientists' diabolical plot. Ben-Gal and Joklik's trial in Basel ended with light sentences for the two men, 2 months in jail, with time served. But it had a secondary result with enormous implications. During the trial, the judge suddenly noticed that one of the spectators was carrying a gun. "How dare you carry a gun in my court?" he indignantly asked. The man answered, "I have a permit to carry a weapon at all times. I am the security officer of the German scientists in Egypt." He identified himself as H-Man, the man who has been contacted by Heidi Goerke after Joklik's phone call, and who actually had alerted the German police. An undercover Mossad informant left the courtroom at once and reported the incident to his superiors. As he heard the report, veteran Mossad agent Rafi Medan jumped aboard the first train to Vienna and hurried to the home of the famous Nazi hunter, Simon Wiesenthal. Wiesenthal immediately agreed to help the Mossad. "Do you know anything about a German named H-Man?" Medan asked. Wiesenthal went to work in his overflowing archives. After a few hours, he returned to Medan with a file in his hands. He was an SS officer during the war, he said. He served in a commando unit under Colonel Otto Skorzeny. Medan brought the information to the omnipresent Rafi Eitan and to Avram Ahitov. A balding, sunburned man with mustache and glasses, Ahitov was born in Germany as Avram Gottfried and immigrated with his religious parents to Israel at the age of 5. At 16, he already was a member of the Haganah, and at 18, one of the founders of the Shabak. Extremely intelligent, he had completed his studies during his service, and graduated from law school summa cum laude. In 1955, he had caught the most important Egyptian spy in Israel, Rifat el-Gamal, who operated under the Israeli identity of Jack Bitton. Ahitov turned el-Gamal, making him one of the Mossad's best double agents, who fed the Egyptians expertly doctored information for more than 12 years. In 1967, on the eve of the Six-Day War, el-Gamal would inform the Egyptians that Israel would launch a ground attack before sending its aircraft into battle. The resulting laxity of the Egyptian Air Force facilitated its destruction on the ground by the Israeli jets. In the future, Ahitov would become one of the best Shabak directors, mostly appreciated for his efforts to integrate Israeli Arabs into the mainstream of Israel's society. On this evening in May 1963, Ahitov listened to Medan's report about Mann and Skorzeny, then turned to Eitan. "Why don't we try to recruit Skorzeny?" The idea seemed bizarre at first, but it had its inner logic. If Skorzeny turned on Mann, he had a chance to obtain highly classified material from his former subordinate. Now the question was how to contact Skorzeny. A quick check revealed that Skorzeny's estranged wife had stayed very close to him. She was now managing a company that specialized in metal trading. The Mossad agents found an Israeli businessman, Shlomo Zablodovich, who was in the same line of business, and contacted him. Yes, he said, he knew Ms. Skorzeny. He introduced them to the lady, who told them all they needed to know. That was how Eitan and Ahitov showed up in Skorzeny's office in Madrid. They now asked the former Third Reich hero to become their agent and provide the Mossad with information about the activities of the German scientists in Egypt. Besides Eichmann, Skorzeny knew quite a few leaders of the German community in Egypt, many of whom were his former fellow officers. "How can I trust you?" Skorzeny asked. "How can I be sure that you won't go after me later?" He feared that Israeli avengers would find him as they found Eichmann, and his fate would be the same. Rafi Eitan found the solution right away. "We are authorized to offer you freedom from fear," he said. He took a sheet of paper and wrote Skorzeny a letter, in the name of the State of Israel, which guaranteed him freedom from fear and assured him that he would not be subject to any kind of persecution or violence. Skorzeny perused the document, then fell silent. He got up and paced back and forth, immersed in thought. He finally turned to the Israelis. "I agree," he said. In the following months, Skorzeny brought to his Mossad handlers priceless intelligence about the activities of the German scientists in Egypt. With the help of Eichmann and his other former cohorts, he obtained detailed lists of the German scientists and their addresses, reports about the progress of their projects, plans, and blueprints of the missiles, correspondence about the failures to assemble a guidance system for the missiles. But Issa Horel wasn't there anymore to read Skorzeny's reports. In the meantime, the Israeli media had been set loose. Shrieking headlines, editorials, cartoons, and even poems announced that Germany of 1963 was the same as Germany of 1933, and the same Germany that had massacred 6 million Jews was now helping Egypt prepare a new Holocaust. In the Knesset, opposition leader Menahem Begin shouted at Ben-Gurion in an inflammatory tirade, "You are selling Uzis to the Germans, and they are sending germs to our enemies." In a speech, Issa's ally Golda Meir accused the Germans in Egypt of producing weapons whose aim is to destroy all living things. These accusations were exaggerated, almost totally detached from reality. Amos Manor, head of the Shabak and a close friend of Issa, would tell us later, during this period, when Issa directed the campaign against the German scientists, he was an unbalanced man. It was much deeper than obsession. You couldn't have a normal conversation on this subject with him. Deputy Minister of Defense Shimon Peres, who returned to Israel on March 24 from a trip to Africa, immediately perceived the tremendous danger that could arise from Issa Horel's crusade. He also realized that the stories about the weapons that kill any living thing were simply ludicrous. A man, the IDF's intelligence branch, presented him with a totally different estimate. "We gathered all that we could collect," said the IDF intelligence chief, General May Amit, and slowly a picture emerged. This story had been blown out of any proportion. Our people said that this couldn't be true, it couldn't be something serious. Amit's people didn't find any indication that the German scientists were developing chemical or bacteriological weapons. The stories about doomsday weapons seemed borrowed from science fiction. The quantities of cobalt brought to Egypt were infinitesimal. It was also established that Dr. Otto Jocklick, whose testimony had played a major part in the whole business, was no more than an opportunist who could not be trusted. The Amman report reached Ben-Gurion's desk on March 24. He immediately summoned Issa Horel and questioned him about his sources. He demanded full and accurate answers. Issa admitted having sent reporters to Europe. After a thorough briefing, he also admitted that he had no information about poison gas, radiology, or cobalt bombs. The next day Ben-Gurion met with Shimon Peres, who came with the Chief of Staff and General Amit. The Amman chief made a detailed report that painted a clear picture. The scientists working in Egypt were mediocre, and they were building obsolete missiles. Their activities were dangerous indeed, but the panic that had spread in the governing circles in Israel, including the Ministry of Defense and the IDF, was utterly out of proportion. Ben-Gurion summoned Issa again. Their conversation was tense, and Ben-Gurion expressed doubts as to the accuracy of Issa's reports and assessments. The total trust that characterized the relations between the two men was replaced by an angry debate that also touched upon the other aspects of German-Israeli relations. Issa, furious, returned to his office and dispatched a letter of resignation to Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion tried to talk him out of leaving, but Issa was adamant. "I resign," he said, "and that's final." This was the end of an era. Ben-Gurion then asked Issa to stay until a replacement was found. Issa refused. "Tell Ben-Gurion to send somebody right away and take the keys," he said to Ben-Gurion's secretary. The Prime Minister had to find a replacement for the legendary Mossad right away. "Get me Amos Manor at once," he said to his secretary, who rushed to the telephone. But the head of the Shabak was unreachable. He was on his way to Kibbutz Margan in the Jordan Valley to visit relatives, and cell phones had yet to be invented. "Then get me May," Ben-Gurion said impatiently. General May Amit was on a tour of inspection in the Negev, but was reached by radio and summoned to Tel Aviv. On his arrival, he learned that he was being appointed acting Mossad director until a new chief took charge of the organization. A few weeks later, Amit's appointment became final. Following Peres's discreet letter to Franz Joseph Strauss, Germany charged a respected expert, Professor Böhm, to devise the means of bringing back the scientists from Egypt. Germany indeed succeeded in tempting many of the scientists by offering them employment in research institutions on its territory. The others gradually left Egypt. They didn't finish building missiles, their navigation systems failed, the missile warheads were not filled with radioactive materials, and even Messerschmitt's plane never took off. One of the authors of this book traveled to Huntsville, Alabama, and met there with NASA's blue-eyed boy, Dr. Wernher von Braun. Von Braun went over the lists of German scientists in Egypt and their alleged projects and concluded that there were very slim chances that these second-rate scientists would have ever been able to build effective missiles. Herr Dr. Mahmoud's Egyptian endeavor ended in complete failure. The affair of the German scientists brought about the fall of Issa Horel and the rise of May Amit. Horel developed a deep loathing toward his successor and bitterly fought him during his years as Mossad. The affair of the German scientists also undermined Ben-Gurion's political power, and he resigned from office a few months later. In Cairo, the Egyptian Secret Services unmasked Wolfgang Lutz, the Champagne spy, and arrested him in 1965. Yet they failed to crack his German cover. He was sentenced only to jail and released after 2.5 years. The end of the affair was also the end of the Mossad's work with Otto Skorzeny, the most improbable agent who ever spied for the Jewish state. Episode 9. Our Man in Damascus. My dear Nadia, my dear family. I am writing to you these last words, hoping that you'll remain united forever. I ask my wife to forgive me, to take care of herself and give a good education to our children. My dearest Nadia, you may remarry, so that our children will have a father. You are absolutely free in that respect. I ask you not to mourn the past, but turn to the future. I am sending you my last kisses. Please pray for my soul. Yours, Ellie. This letter reached the desk of the new Mossad, May Amit, in May 1965. Eli Cohen, one of the boldest spies in the history of espionage, had written it with a trembling hand, just a few minutes before his life came to an abrupt end on the gallows of Damascus. The secret life of Eli Cohen had begun more than 20 years before. A young, handsome Egyptian Jew, Cohen was on his way home one humid afternoon in mid-July 1954. He was 30, of medium height, sporting a neat black mustache and a disarming smile. On a Cairo street he bumped into an old friend, a police officer. "Tonight we'll arrest some Israeli terrorists," the officer confided. "One of them is called Shmuel Azar." Eli faked awe and admiration, but as soon as he parted with his friend, he ran to his rented apartment and removed the handgun, the explosives, and the documents he kept there. Eli was deeply involved in clandestine activities. He planned escape routes and prepared false documents for Jewish families that wanted to emigrate to Israel. He also was a member of the Jewish underground responsible for an ambitious operation known as the Levon Affair. In early 1954, Israel's leaders learned that the British government had decided to pull out of Egypt completely. Egypt was the strongest of the Arab countries and a sworn enemy of Israel. As long as the British Army was present in Egypt and maintained scores of army bases and military airfields along the Suez Canal, Israel could count on its moderating influence over the military junta that governed the country. With the decision to evacuate Egypt, that influence would evaporate at once. Besides, modern bases, airfields, and huge stores of equipment and war materials would fall in the hands of the Egyptian army. Israel, then only 6 years old, could be the target of an aggressive attack by a larger, better-equipped Egyptian army that wanted to avenge its shameful defeat in the 1948 Israel Independence War. Could the British decision be revoked? Ben-Gurion was not at the helm of Israel anymore. He had retired to Kibbutz Sde Boker. He had been replaced by a moderate but weak leader, Moshe Sharett. Minister of Defense Pinhas Lavon openly disputed Sharett's authority. Without Sharett's knowledge, and without informing the Mossad, Lavon and Colonel Benjamin Ghibli, the head of military intelligence, Taman, concocted a dangerous and foolish plan. They found a clause in the British-Egyptian agreement that allowed Great Britain to return to its former bases in case of a grave crisis, and naively concluded that if several terrorist bombings were to sweep Egypt, Britain would conclude that Egypt's leaders couldn't maintain law and order. Therefore, the British would cancel their decision to pull out of the country. Lavon and Ghibli decided to carry out several bombings in Cairo and Alexandria, targeting American and British libraries and cultural centers, cinemas, post offices, and other public buildings. Amman's secret agents in Egypt recruited some young local Jews, fervent Zionists, who were ready to give their lives for Israel. By doing that, Amman broke a sacrosanct rule of Israel's intelligence community: never use local Jews in hostile operations, as that could cost them their lives and place the entire Jewish community in grave danger. In addition, the young men and women had no preliminary training for such operations. The bombs were rudimentary, made out of eyeglass cases in which a chemical substance had been placed. Another substance was poured into a condom introduced into the case, highly corrosive. The chemical would burn its way through the condom and come into contact with the other substance inside the case, producing a minor burst of fire. The condom was used as a timing tool, to allow the person placing the incendiary device to escape before the explosion. The plan was doomed from the start. On July 23, after a couple of minor operations, one of the bombs exploded in the pocket of Philip Natanson, a member of the Zionist network, at the entrance of Cinema Rio in Alexandria. He was arrested by the police, and in the following days all the network members were caught. Eli Cohen was arrested as well, but the search of his apartment failed to discover any incriminating evidence. He was released, but the Egyptian police opened a file on him. It included 3 photos and the record of Eli Shaul Juandy Cohen, born in 1924 in Alexandria, to Shaul and Sophie Cohen, who had emigrated to an unknown destination in 1949 with Eli's 2 sisters and 5 brothers. The suspect was a graduate of the French College and a student at the Cairo Farouk University. The Egyptians didn't know that Eli's family had emigrated to Israel and settled in Bat Yam, a suburb of Tel Aviv. In spite of the arrests, Eli decided to stay in Egypt and not run away. Fearing the worst for his friends, he collected every bit of information about their incarceration, beatings, and torture in Egypt's jail. In October, the Egyptians publicly announced the arrest of Israeli spies, and on December 7, their trial opened in Cairo. Max Bennett, an Israeli undercover agent who was arrested with the group, killed himself by cutting his wrists with a rusty nail he had pulled out of his cell door. At the trial, the prosecution asked for the death penalty for some of the detainees. Pleas for mercy streamed from the papal nuncio, the French foreign minister, the US and Great Britain's ambassadors, members of the British House of Commons Richard Crossman and Maurice Auerbach, the chief rabbi of Egypt. All was in vain. On January 17, 1955, the Extraordinary Military Court announced the sentences. 2 of the accused were found not guilty, 2 were sentenced to 7 years of prison with hard labor, 2 to 15 years, and 2 to life. The 2 leaders of the network, Dr. Moshe Marzuk and the engineer Shmuel Azar, were sentenced to death and hanged, 4 days later, in the courtyard of Cairo prison. In Israel, a tremendous political scandal shook the government. Who had given the stupid, criminal order for that operation? Several boards of inquiry failed to reach a clear-cut answer. Levon and Ghibli pointed fingers at each other. Minister of Defense Levon was forced to resign and was replaced by Ben-Gurion, who came back from retirement. Colonel Ghibli was never promoted and after a short while had to leave the army. In Egypt, Eli Cohen had lost some of his best friends. Although still a suspect in the eyes of the authorities, he stayed in Cairo and pursued his clandestine activities. Only in 1957, after the Suez War, did he immigrate to Israel. The Cairo Martyrs is the name of a quiet, shady street in Bat Yam. Eli walked that street every day when coming to visit his family. His first steps in Israel were not easy. For a few weeks he was looking for a job. Thanks to his fluency in languages, Arabic, French, English, and even Hebrew, he found a position translating weekly and monthly magazines for a man. His office on a Tel Aviv street was camouflaged as a commercial agency. Eli was paid a modest salary, 170 Israeli pounds, $95 a month. After a few months he was fired. One of his friends, also an Egyptian Jew, found him a new job. Accountant at the department store chain Hamashbir. The job was boring, but the pay was higher. At that time his brother introduced him to a pretty, smart young nurse of Iraqi origin. A month after meeting her, Eli wed Nadia, the sister of a rising intellectual Sami Michael. One morning, a man walked into Eli's office. "My name is Zalman," he said. "I am an intelligence officer. I want to offer you a job." "What kind of job?" "Quite interesting, actually. You'll travel to Europe a lot. Perhaps you'll even have to go to Arab countries as our agent." Eli refused. "I just got married," he said. "I don't want to travel to Europe or to any other place." That was the end of the conversation, but not the end of the affair. Nadia got pregnant and had to leave her job. Hamashbir had to restructure and fired a few employees, Eli among them. He couldn't find another job. And then, as if by chance, an unexpected visitor knocked on the door of his rented apartment. It was Zalman again. "Why do you refuse to work for us?" he asked Ellie. "We shall pay you £350, $195 a month. You'll train for 6 months. Then, if you like it, you'll stay. If not, you'll be free to go." This time, Ellie didn't say no. And he became a secret agent. Some of the Amman veterans tell a different version. They maintain that when he arrived in Israel, Ellie didn't get a job at Amman because the psychological tests he underwent showed him to be overconfident. He was gifted, courageous, and had an excellent memory, but had the tendency to overestimate himself and take unnecessary risks. These character traits, combined, made him unsuitable for Amman. But in the early 60s, things changed. Amman's Unit 131, the Special Operations Unit of the IDF Intelligence Branch, urgently started looking for a highly qualified agent in Damascus, the capital of Syria. In the last few years, Syria had become the most aggressive Arab country, and the sworn enemy of Israel. It never missed a chance to attack. Syria confronted Israel in bloody battles at the Golan Heights and on the shores of the Lake of Galilee. It dispatched squads of terrorists across the Israeli border. And now, it planned to carry out a grandiose engineering project, intended to divert the waters of the Jordan River tributaries and deprive Israel of water. In the late 50s, Israel had launched a project of huge pipelines and canals that would carry a part of the Jordan water to the arid Negev region. The water was taken from the part of the river that passed through Israel's territory. The water project triggered a series of Arab summit conferences. The Arab nations solemnly decided to divert the Jordan tributaries and kill the Israeli project. The job itself fell to Syria. Israel could not survive without Jordan's water. It could not let Syria succeed, and started planning a response. It needed an agent in Damascus, somebody trustworthy, confident, and daring. The same characteristics that had forced Amman to reject Ellie before made him perfect now for Unit 131. 50 years later, it was revealed that Amman had tried to recruit somebody else for that job, Sami Michael, Nadia Cohen's brother. Michael refused, stayed in Israel, and became one of its great poets. Cohen's training was long and exhausting. Every morning, under some pretext, Ellie would leave home and head for the Amman training center. For several weeks, he had only one instructor, a man named Yitzhak. First, he learned how to memorize things. Yitzhak would throw a dozen objects on the table: a pencil, a bunch of keys, a cigarette, an eraser, a few pins. Ellie glanced at them for a second or two. Then he had to close his eyes and describe what they looked like. He also learned to identify the type and make of tanks, aircrafts, and cannons. "Let's go for a walk," Yitzhak would say. The two of them would stroll in the crowded Tel Aviv streets. "Do you see the newspaper stand over there?" Yitzhak would whisper. "Now, go there and pretend to be looking at the papers, but at the same time try to find out who is following you." When they returned to the center, Yitzhak would listen to Ellie's report and then throw a batch of photos on the table. "You were right about this one, he followed you indeed, but what about that one, by the tree? He was also shadowing you." One morning, Zalman introduced him to another instructor, Yehuda, who taught him how to use a small, sophisticated radio transmitter. He then sent Ellie to undergo physical exams and psychological tests. After the tests were over, Zalman introduced Ellie to a young woman, Mossad cousin. "It's time for the decisive test, Ellie," he said. "Marcel will give you a French passport in the name of an Egyptian Jew who has immigrated to Africa and now has come to Israel as a tourist. With this passport you'll go to Jerusalem and stay there 10 days. Mossad will give you full details about your cover, your past in Egypt, your family, your work in Africa. In Jerusalem you'll only speak French and Arabic. You have to meet people, make friends, and establish new contacts without revealing your real identity. You must also make sure that you're not followed. Eli spent 10 days in Jerusalem. On his return he got a few days of leave. Nadia had just given birth to a daughter, Sophie. After Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, Zalman introduced him to two other men, who didn't identify themselves. "You've passed your test in Jerusalem, Eli," one of them said with a smile. "It's time to get to more serious matters." In a bare room at the Amman facility, Eli met a Muslim sheikh who patiently taught him the Quran and the Muslim prayers. Eli tried to concentrate, but kept making mistakes. "Don't worry," his instructors told him. "If somebody starts asking you questions, tell them that you're not a devout Muslim, and you only have vague religious memories from your days at school." Now Eli was given a foretaste of his mission. He would soon be sent to a neutral country abroad, and after additional training he would proceed to an Arab capital. "Which one?" he asked. "You'll be told in due time." Zalman went on. "You'll pose as an Arab, create local contacts, and establish an Israeli espionage network." Eli agreed without hesitating. He felt confident that he could carry out the mission. "You'll get papers of a Syrian or an Iraqi," his handlers told him. "Why?" "I don't know anything about Iraq." "Get me Egyptian papers." "That's impossible," Zalman said. "The Egyptians have updated records of their population and of all the passports they have issued. That's too dangerous. Iraq and Syria don't have such records. They can't track you down." 2 days later, Zalman and his colleagues revealed to Eli his new identity. "Your name is Kamal. Your father's name is Amin Tabet, so your full name will be Kamal Amin Tabet." Eli's case officers had prepared a detailed legend, a cover story, for their new agent. "You're the son of Syrian parents. Your mother's name is Saida Ibrahim. You had a sister. You were born in Beirut, in Lebanon. When you were 3, your family left Lebanon and moved to Egypt, to Alexandria. Don't forget, your family is Syrian. A year later your sister died. Your father was a textile merchant. In 1946 your uncle emigrated to Argentina. Shortly after, he wrote to your father and invited your family to join him in Buenos Aires. In 1947 all of you arrived in Argentina. Your father and your uncle established a partnership with a third person and opened a textile store, but it went bankrupt. Your father died in 1956 and 6 months later your mother died, too. You lived with your uncle and worked at a travel agency. You later went into business and were very successful." Eli now needed a cover story for his family as well. "I got a job with a company that works with the defense and foreign ministries," Eli told Nadia when he came back home. "They need somebody to travel in Europe, buy tools, equipment, and materials for TARAS, Israel's military industry, and find markets for its products. I'll come home often, for long leaves. I know that the separation will be hard, for both of us, but you'll get my full salary here, and in a few years we'll buy furniture in Europe and set up the apartment." In early February 1961 an unmarked car brought Eli to Lod Airport. A young man who identified himself as Gideon handed him an Israeli passport in his real name, $500, and a plane ticket to Zurich. On his arrival in Zurich, Eli was met by a white-haired man, who took his passport and gave him a passport from a European country, in another name. That passport carried an entry visa to Chile and a transit visa to Argentina. "In Buenos Aires our people will extend your transit visa," the man said, slipping into Ellie's hand a plane ticket to Santiago, with a stopover in Buenos Aires. "Tomorrow you'll arrive in Buenos Aires. The day after, at 11 a.m., you should come to Café Corrientes. Our people will meet you there." Ellie arrived in Argentina's capital and checked into a hotel. The following morning, at 11 o'clock on the dot, an elderly man came to his table at Café Corrientes and introduced himself as Abraham. Cohen was instructed to settle in a furnished apartment, already rented for him. A local teacher would get in touch with him and teach him the Spanish language. "You'll have no other concerns," Abraham said. "I'll take care of your finances." 3 months later, Ellie was ready for the next stage. He spoke passable Spanish, knew Buenos Aires well, dressed and behaved like thousands of Arab immigrants living in Argentina's capital. Another tutor trained him to speak Arabic with a Syrian accent. Abraham met him again in a cafe and handed him a Syrian passport in the name of Kamal Amin Tabet. "You must change your address by the end of the week," Abraham said. "Open a bank account in that name. Start visiting the Arab restaurants, the cinemas where Arab movies are shown, and the Arab cultural and political clubs. Try to make as many friends as possible, and establish contacts with the Arab community leaders. You are a man of means, a merchant and a brilliant businessman. You are in the import-export business, but you also are involved in transports and investments. Make generous contributions to the charity funds of the Arab community. Good luck." The Israeli spy, indeed, had plenty of good luck. In a few months, Eli Cohen successfully penetrated the core of the Arab-Syrian community in Buenos Aires. His personal charm, confidence, common sense, and fortune attracted quite a few Arabs, among the most important in Argentina. He soon became a well-known figure in Arab circles. His breakthrough came in the Muslim club one evening when he met a dignified gentleman, well-dressed, balding, his face adorned with a bushy mustache. He introduced himself as Abdel Latif Hassan, editor-in-chief of the Arab World magazine published in Argentina. Hassan was deeply impressed with the serious personality of the Syrian immigrant, and the two of them became close friends. The cultural events at the clubs were followed by more intimate gatherings in the company of the Arab community leaders. Eli made it to the Syrian embassy guest list and was invited to posh parties and receptions. At an official reception at the embassy, Hassan steered his friend Tabet to an imposing-looking officer, dressed in the uniform of a Syrian general. "Allow me to introduce a real and devoted Syrian patriot," Hassan said to the general. And then, turning to Eli, he added, "Meet General Amin El-Hulfez, the military attaché at the embassy." Eli seemed to have completed the final stage in establishing his legend. Time had come for the real espionage mission. Eli was briefed in a short, surreptitious meeting with Abraham in July 1961. The next day, he came to Hassan's office. "I am sick and tired of living in Argentina," he admitted. He loved Syria more than anything, and wanted to go back. Could Hassan help him with some letters of recommendation? The editor immediately wrote 4 letters, 1 to his brother-in-law in Alexandria, 2 to friends in Beirut, one of them a highly influential banker, and the 4th to his son in Damascus. Eli visited his other Arab friends, and his briefcase was soon full of enthusiastic letters of recommendation, written by the leaders of the Buenos Aires community. At the end of July 1961, Kamal Amin Tabet flew to Zurich, changed planes, and proceeded to Munich. At the airport of the Bavarian capital, an Israeli agent approached him. His name was Zillinger. He handed Eli his Israeli passport and a plane ticket to Tel Aviv. In early August, Eli came home. "I'll spend some months at home," he said to Nadia. The following months passed in intensive training. Eli's cover was perfect and he completely identified with his new character. His radio instructor, Yehuda, was back and trained him in radio transmission in code. After a few weeks he was able to receive and transmit between 12 and 16 words a minute. He compulsively read books and documents on Syria, its army, weapons, and strategy. After myriad briefings by specialists, he himself became an expert on Syrian internal politics. In December 1961, Eli flew to Zurich again, but his final destination was Damascus, the lion's den. The tension on the Syrian-Israeli border had grown as the Syrian regime had weakened. Since 1948, a long series of military coups had shaken the country. Very rarely did a Syrian dictator die a natural death anymore. They died on the gallows, in front of a firing squad, or by the good services of an assassin. The unstable country was in constant turmoil. Quite often, eager to distract the public's attention from inner problems, the Syrian leaders deliberately caused border incidents. Public executions were a common sight in Damascus's squares. One after the other, the hangman put to death people labeled as conspirators, spies, enemies of the state, and supporters of the former regime. Not long before Eli arrived, there had been yet another coup. On September 28, 1961, it had put an end to the short-lived Syrian-Egyptian Union, pompously named the United Arab Republic. Before setting out on his mission, Eli met the ubiquitous Zalman, who gave him detailed instructions. "You'll get your radio transmitter from Zillinger, our man in Munich. After you arrive in Damascus, you'll be contacted by an employee of the Syrian Broadcasting Corporation. He, too, is an immigrant like you who has settled in Syria not long ago. He doesn't know your real identity. Don't try to find him. He'll find the right moment to establish contact with you." In Munich, Zillinger had for him an impressive package of spying equipment, sheets of paper, on which the key to the transmission code was written with invisible ink, books serving as transmission codes, a special typewriter, a transistor radio, in which a transmitter had been inserted, an electric razor whose cord served as an antenna for the transmitter, dynamite sticks hidden in Yardley soap and cigars, and some cyanide pills for suicide. Just in case. Eli wondered how he would introduce all this equipment to Syria, where customs and immigration controls were thorough and severe. Zillinger had the answer. "You'll buy a passage on the SS Astoria that sails from Genoa to Beirut in early January. Somebody will get in touch with you on the boat. He'll help you pass the border controls in Syria." Eli set sail aboard the Astoria. One morning, when he was sitting close to a group of Egyptian passengers, a man approached him and whispered, "Follow me." Eli got up and strolled away from the group. The man told him, "My name is Majid Sheikh Elord. I've got a car." That was a hint that he would drive Eli to Damascus. Elord, a short, mousy man, was an international entrepreneur and a well-known and shady businessman in Damascus. He was married to an Egyptian Jewess, and yet he had chosen to pass the World War II years in Nazi Germany. His fickle and greedy character made him seem an unsavory partner, which attracted the Israeli services' attention. They soon made him their agent, even though he didn't realize it. He believed he was working for right-wing Syrian extremists who were acting undercover. He truly believed in Kamal Amin Tabbat's legend, and in the coming years was to be of great help to the Israeli spy. His first task was to make sure that Tabbat's baggage would safely go through Syrian controls. January 10, 1962. Elord's car, coming from Beirut, was stopped at the Syrian border. In the trunk were Eli Cohen's bags, full of transmission equipment and other incriminating items. Eli was sitting in the passenger seat, beside Sheikh Elord. "We are going to meet my friend Abu Khaldan," Elord told Eli when they approached the border. "He happens to be in financial trouble. $500 would certainly improve his situation." And so, $500 quickly made their way from the Israeli agent's wallet to the pocket of Abu Khaldan, the Syrian customs inspector. The barrier was raised and the car sailed into the desert. Eli Cohen was in Syria. In bustling Damascus, strewn with crowded mosques and colorful souks, it was not difficult to melt into the crowd. But Eli wanted the exact opposite. He wanted to be noticed, and fast. He rented a luxurious villa in the classy Abu Rahman neighborhood, close to Syrian army headquarters. From the villa's balcony, Eli could watch the entrance to the Syrian government's official guest house. His house stood among foreign embassies, rich businessmen's homes, and the official residences of the nation's leaders. Eli immediately concealed his secret equipment in various hiding places throughout the house. In order to avoid the risk of informers or traitors in his own household, he decided to refrain from hiring servants and lived alone. He was lucky again. He had arrived in Damascus at the right moment. The United Arab Republic collapse was regarded by President Nasser in Cairo as a personal affront and a humiliation to Egypt. The Syrian leaders, both politicians and military, were obsessed with the possibility of an Egyptian-inspired coup, and Israeli espionage was not on their agenda. On the other hand, they badly needed new allies, supporters, and sources of funding, both in Syria and among the Syrian émigrés overseas. Kamal Amin Tabet, the staunchly nationalist millionaire, armed with excellent letters of recommendation, was the right man at the right time. Cohen established his contacts quickly and effectively. His letters of recommendation opened the gates to the high society, the banks, and the commercial circles that had inspired the coup of September 28. His new friends introduced Eli to top government officials, senior army officers, and leaders of the ruling party. Two rich businessmen courted the young and handsome millionaire, hoping he would marry one of their daughters. In a display of generosity, Tabet contributed a substantial sum of money to the building of a public kitchen for the poor of Damascus. His new popularity paved his way to the governing circles, yet he refrained from identifying with Syria's new rulers because he intuitively felt that this was only temporary. Syria was still to go through major internal aftershocks following the separation from Egypt. A month after his arrival in Damascus, Eli was visited by George Salem Seif, a radio show host in charge of Radio Damascus broadcasts for Syrians abroad. He was the man whom Zalman had mentioned at Eli's last briefing in Israel. Seif had returned to Syria a while before Tabet. Because of his position, he could supply Eli with inside information about the political and military situation. Seif also showed Eli the secret guidelines by the Ministry of Propaganda, outlining what he could broadcast and what he had to conceal from his audiences. At the parties held in Seif's house, Eli met several senior officials and well-known politicians. Seif, like Elord, had no clue about Eli Cohen's real identity. He, too, believed Tabet was a fanatical nationalist who had his own political agenda. Eli Cohen realized that he had become the loneliest spy in the world, with not even one friend and confidant. He didn't know if there was another Israeli network operating in Damascus. He needed nerves of steel to withstand the stress of his terrible solitude, and to play a dangerous role 24 hours a day. He knew that even during his rare visits home, he couldn't share his secret with his wife, and had to mislead her, too. He started transmitting his messages to Israel daily, at 8 a.m., and sometimes in the evening as well. His broadcasts were carried out under a foolproof cover. His transmitter was located in his villa, very close to the army headquarters, which was the source of endless transmissions. Nobody could discern the difference between Ellie's broadcasts and the myriad messages emanating from the army communications center. 6 months after arriving in Syria, Kamal Amin Tabet had become a well-known figure in Damascus high society. He then decided to go abroad for business. He first flew to Argentina, where he met several of his Arab friends, then traveled to Europe, changed planes and identities, and, on a hot summer night, landed in Lod Airport. Laden with presents, the traveling salesman arrived in his modest apartment in Bat Yam, where Nadia and Sophie were waiting for him. At the end of fall, Eli Cohen flew to Europe. A few days later, Kamal Amin Tabet arrived in Damascus. During his stay in Israel, his superiors in Amman had equipped him with a miniature camera so he could photograph sites and documents. He had to conceal the microfilms in expensive boxes containing backgammon pieces. The boxes were made of polished wood embellished with a mosaic of nacre and ivory. The mosaic ornament could be dug out of the polished wood and reinserted after the microfilm had been placed in the cavity. Tabet would send the backgammon sets to friends in Argentina, who would dispatch them to Israel with a diplomatic pouch. Some of the first documents sent by Eli were reports on the growing unrest in the army and the rising power of the Ba'ath, Resurrection, Socialist Party. Eli felt a profound change of mood in Syria and let his intuition guide him. He established close contacts with the Ba'ath leaders and contributed large sums of money to the party. He had done the right thing. On March 8, 1963, a new coup shook Damascus. The army deposed the government and the Ba'ath Party seized power in Syria. General Hafez, Eli's friend from Buenos Aires, was appointed Minister of Defense in Salah al-Bito's cabinet. In July, a new coup took place, this time inside the regime. Hafez became president of the Revolutionary Council and head of state. Tabet's best friends were appointed to key positions in the cabinet and the military hierarchy. The Israeli spy was now a member of the inner circle of power. A glamorous party in Damascus. One after the other, the luxury cars of ministers and generals arrive at the sprawling villa. A long line of guests in evening attire and resplendent uniforms proceeds into the house, where the host is warmly welcoming his guests. The guest list reads like a who's who in Damascus: several ministers, including the Minister of Defense and the Minister for Agrarian Reform, a large number of generals and colonels, the top leaders of the Ba'ath Party, businessmen and tycoons. Many of them are standing around Colonel Salim Haytham, the officer who led his tanks into Damascus on the night of the coup and actually handed General Hafez the presidency. President Hafez himself arrives later and warmly shakes the hand of the host, his friend Kamal Amin Tabet. He is accompanied by Mrs. Hafez, stunning in the mink coat presented to her by Tabet as a token of the Syrian emigrants' admiration for the president and his wife. She is not the only one to have received expensive gifts. Quite a few women wear the jewelry, and senior officials drive the cars, given them by Tabet. Important political dealers have deposited his money into their accounts. In the living room, a group of officials and army officers, back from the Israel border, discuss the military situation. They are joined by entrepreneurs and engineers who work on the ambitious project of diverting the tributaries of the Jordan River. In the spacious hall, the directors of the government-sponsored Radio Damascus and the heads of the Ministry of Propaganda stand together. Tabet is one of them now. The government has asked him to run some radio broadcasts to emigrant communities overseas. Tabet has another radio show, where he analyzes political and economic issues. That party, as many others, costs Tabet a fortune, but he doesn't even blink. He has reached the apex of success, and it seems that there is no door he can't open. He has good friends in the army headquarters, and he regularly participates in policymaking meetings of the Ba'ath Party. Eli kept transmitting reports of military character, names, and functions of senior officers, top-secret military orders, and other items to Israel. He photographed and dispatched military maps, mostly the detailed blueprints of the fortifications along the Israeli border, to Amman. He sent reports on new weapons introduced in the Syrian army. He also described the Syrians' capacity to absorb new weapons. Months later, a Syrian general bitterly admitted there was no army secret that remained unknown to Eli Cohen. Eli transmitted every morning to Israel and didn't fear capture, thanks to the protective umbrella of the Syrian army broadcasts from the nearby headquarters. But once, a friend, the Army Lieutenant Zahar al-Din, paid him a surprise visit. Eli succeeded in hiding the transmitter, but a sheaf of papers with the secret code, in the form of grids filled with letters, remained on the table. "What's this?" Zahar wanted to know. "Oh, just crosswords," Eli said. Besides the transmissions and the backgammon boxes for his Argentinian friends, Eli developed a third way of communicating with Israel, Radio Damascus. He worked out with his superiors in Tel Aviv a code of words and phrases, which he inserted into his radio broadcasts and which were duly decoded by Amman. He now took another step in his efforts to obtain top-secret information. A rumor started running in the governing circles in Damascus that Tabet held illicit sex parties in his villa. Only his close, intimate friends were invited to these parties, where the guests met a large number of pretty women. Some of them were street hookers, others, girls from good families. Tabet's guests enjoyed wild sex, but their host was the only one who did not lose his cool. Tabet also supplied sexy and generous secretaries to his high-placed friends. One of these friends was Colonel Salim Haytham, whose mistress passed to Tabet every word she heard from her colonel. Tabet showed extreme patriotic fervor when he spoke about Israel, which he defined as the vilest enemy of Arab nationalism. He urged the leaders of Syria to increase their anti-Israeli propaganda and open a second front against Israel, besides Egypt. He even accused his friends of not doing enough against the Israeli aggressor. In doing so, he achieved his goal. His military friends were determined to prove him wrong, and to show him they were ready for battle with the enemy. On 3 occasions, they took him to visit the Syrian positions along Israel's border. They let him see the fortifications and the bunkers, showed him the weapons concentrated in the area, and described their defensive and offensive plans. Lieutenant Zahar al-Din took him to the El Hama military camp, where large quantities of new weapons had been stored. On his 4th visit to the Israeli border, Tabet was the only civilian in a group of Syrian and Egyptian high-ranking officers. The group was headed by the most respected Arab military leader, the Egyptian General Ali Amer, head of the United Arab Commandment, who commanded, at least on paper, the combined forces of Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. Right after Amer's visit, the Ba'ath leaders charged Tabet with a vital assignment. He was sent on a mission of reconciliation to the elderly Ba'ath leader Salah al-Baita, who had been deposed by General Hulfez, and was since on a cure in Jericho. Tabet traveled to Jordan and spent a few days with the former prime minister. Back in Damascus, Tabet accompanied to the airport the ailing President Hulfez, who was on his way to get medical treatment in Paris. When Hulfez returned a few weeks later, Tabet was once again in the welcoming line, waiting on the tarmac, his mission successfully completed. In 1963, an important change took place in Israel. The new Ramsad who replaced Little Issa, May Amit, had been for a few months in charge of both Amman and the Mossad. Amit decided to abolish Unit 131 and transfer all its men and operations to the Mossad. One morning, Eli Cohen learned that his employer had changed, and he was now a Mossad agent. That same year, Nadia gave birth to a second daughter, Iris. But in November 1964, during his second visit to Israel that same year, Eli saw his secret dream come true. Nadia had a third child, a son. He was named Shaul. During that visit we noticed that Eli had changed, his family members said later. He was withdrawn, nervous, and grim. He lost his temper several times. He didn't want to go out, didn't want to meet friends. "Soon I'll quit my job," he said to us. "Next year I'll come back to Israel. I won't leave my family anymore." At the end of November, Eli kissed his wife and 3 children goodbye and flew away again. Nadia didn't know that this was the last goodbye. November 13, 1964, was a Wednesday. Syrian positions at the Israeli border, close to Tel Dan, opened fire on Israeli tractors that were working in the demilitarized zone. The Israeli reaction was formidable. Tanks and cannon riposted with heavy fire, and minutes later Mirage and Vorta aircraft joined the battle. The aircraft pounded the Syrian positions, then dived toward the site of the deviation of the Jordan waters and blasted the canals dug by the Syrians. Heavy mechanical equipment, bulldozers, tractors, and shovels were systematically destroyed. The Syrian Air Force didn't interfere, as it had not yet mastered its newly acquired Soviet MiG fighters. The world press almost unanimously validated the Israeli response to the Syrian aggression. Months later, Syrian officers would say that one of the Israeli attacks architects had been Eli Cohen, who was in Israel during the battle. Thanks to Cohen, the Israelis were fully aware of the poor state of the Syrian Air Force and its inability to go to battle at that stage. The Israelis also had detailed knowledge of the Syrian fortifications and the water deviation works. They knew exactly what kinds and quantities of weapons were positioned in each base and bunker. But Eli Cohen knew much more than that. He had succeeded in befriending a Saudi entrepreneur who had been contracted to plan and dig the first canals of the Syrian project. Thanks to that friendship, the Israelis learned, months in advance, where the excavations would take place, how deep and wide the canals would be, what equipment would be used, and other technical details. The contractor also divulged to his friend Tabet the capacity of the canals to withstand bombing from the air and the full extent of the security measures. The name of Cohen's good friend was Bin Laden, little Osama's father. Thanks to the detailed information he shared with the Israeli spy, Israel attacked the project several times, until the Arab countries decided to abandon it completely in 1965. In mid-January 1965, a few weeks after Eli had left Israel, a beautiful postcard landed in Nadia Cohen's mailbox. "My dearest Nadia," Eli wrote in French. "Just a few lines to wish you a happy new year, which I hope will bring happiness to the whole family. Lots of kisses to my darlings, Fifi, Sophie, Iris, and Shaikeh, Shaul, and to you, from the bottom of my heart, Eli." When Nadia received that postcard, Eli was lying, beaten and tortured, on the rough stone floor of a Damascus prison. For several months already, the Syrian Mukhabarat, the secret services, were on high alert. The alarm had been sounded by Chief Tayyara, head of the Palestinian department of the Mukhabarat. Tayyara noticed that since the summer of 1964, almost every decision taken by the Syrian government in the evening, or even during the night, was broadcast the following day in the Arabic language programs of Kol Israel, Israel's government-sponsored radio. Furthermore, Israel had made public some top-secret decisions that had been taken behind closed doors. Tayyara was stunned by the precision of the Israeli bombings during the November 13 incident. His logical conclusion was that the Israelis had exact knowledge of the Syrian army deployment at the front lines, and knew precisely where to hit and how. he became certain that Israel had a spy at the highest levels of the Syrian government. The spy's information was broadcasted by Kol Israel in a matter of hours. This meant he was transmitting his reports by wireless. But where was the transmitter? In the fall of 1964, Toyara and his colleagues made great efforts to locate the secret transmitter with Soviet-made equipment, but failed. And then, in January 1965, they got lucky. A Soviet ship unloaded in Latakia port several huge containers filled with new communications equipment. It was to replace the Syrian army's obsolete instruments. The equipment upgrade took place on January 7, 1965. In order to put in place the new devices and check them out, all army communications were suspended for 24 hours. When silence fell over all army communications throughout the country, an officer on duty by an army receiver discerned a single, faint transmission. The spies broadcast. The officer reached for the telephone. Mukhabarat squads, equipped with Soviet locators, set out at once to find the transmission source. Unfortunately, the transmission stopped before they reached the place. But the technicians' feverish calculations pointed in one direction, the home of Kamal Amin Tabbat. That's a mistake, a senior Mukhabarat officer ruled. It was unthinkable that Tabbat, whom the Ba'ath leaders wanted to appoint minister in the next cabinet, could be a spy. Tabbat was above suspicion. But in the evening, the transmission was there again. The Mukhabarat again sent its cars, and again got the same result. At 8 a.m. precisely, on a sunny January day, four Mukhabarat officers broke into the splendid house in the Abu Rahman neighborhood. They smashed the entrance door, tearing it from its hinges, and then darted toward the bedroom, guns in hands. The spy was there, but he was not sleeping. He was caught red-handed, in the middle of a transmission. He jumped on his feet and faced the officers. He didn't try to run away and didn't resist his captors. For once, the odds were against him. Kamal Amin Tabbat, thundered the commanding officer. "You are under arrest." The news spread through Damascus like wildfire. Fantastic, absurd, impossible, nonsense. There were no words to express the shock and the disbelief of Syria's leaders when they heard the news. Could one of the leaders of the ruling party, a personal friend of the president, a millionaire, and a socialite, be a spy? But the evidence was irrefutable. The transmitter that Tabbat would conceal behind the window shutters, the tiny reserve transmitter hidden in the large chandelier in the living room, the microfilms, the dynamite-stuffed cigars, the code pages. The man was a traitor indeed. Panic-stricken, the heads of the regime ordered a thorough investigation. What exactly did Tabbat know? Could he incriminate them? President Hafez himself came to interrogate him in his cell. During the interrogation, Hafez later testified, "When I looked in Tabbat's eyes, I was suddenly assailed by a terrible suspicion. I felt that the man before me wasn't an Arab at all. Very cautiously I asked him a few questions about the Muslim religion, about the Quran. I asked him to recite the Surah Al-Fatiha, the first chapter of the Quran. Tabbat could barely quote a few verses. He tried to defend himself by saying that he had left Syria while still very young, and his memory was betraying him. But at this moment I knew he was a Jew. Damascus's torturers did the rest. While Tabbat was still lying in his dark cell, unconscious, his face and body covered with ugly wounds, his nails pulled out, his confession was rushed to General Hafez. The man was not Tabbat. He was Eli Cohen, an Israeli Jew. On January 24, 1965, Damascus officially announced the arrest of an important Israeli spy. A senior officer, livid with rage, roared at a press conference, "Israel is the devil, and Cohen is the devil's agent." Panic spread throughout Damascus. Was Cohen a lone wolf or the head of a spy ring? One after the other, 69 people were arrested, 27 of them women. Among the suspects were Majid Sheikh El-Ord, George Salem Seif, Lieutenant Zahar al-Din, senior officials of the Ministry of Propaganda, prostitutes, and other women whose identities were not revealed. 400 people who had been in contact with Tabet were questioned. The investigation exposed some serious problems. Many of Syria's political, military, and business leaders were among Cohen's closest friends. The investigators couldn't touch them. Their names couldn't be mentioned, as any public allusion to them could create the impression that they were complicit in Tabet's spying. The Syrians also found that Tabet had made every possible effort to prevent the publication of any contact between his various informants, therefore it was very difficult to establish the extent of the spy ring. In Israel, the military censorship imposed total blackout on any mention of Cohen's arrest. The Israelis still hoped to save him and were determined to prevent the news about him from reaching the local media. But there were some people who had the right to know. One evening a stranger visited Eli's brothers. "Your brother has been arrested in Damascus and accused of spying for Israel," the man said. The brothers were stunned. One of them, Maurice, rushed to his mother's home in Bat Yam. "Mother, you should be strong," he said. Eli was arrested in Syria. The old woman was speechless. Finally, she managed, "In Syria? How? Did he cross the border by mistake?" When Maurice explained to her what Eli was doing in Damascus, the poor woman collapsed. Nadia stood among her 3 children, astounded. Even though she had suspected all along that her husband didn't reveal everything to her, she never had guessed what his real line of work was. Eli's colleagues tried to calm her down. "You're flying to Paris right away," one of them told her. "We shall hire the best lawyers. We'll do everything possible to save him." May Amit personally took charge of the efforts to rescue Cohen. On January 31st, one of France's greatest lawyers, Jacques Messier, came to Damascus. Officially, he had been hired by the Cohen family. Actually, it was the State of Israel that covered his expenses and his fees. He came to Syria on a mission impossible. "From my first day in Damascus," he said later, "I realized that Eli Cohen's fate was sealed. He would hang. Now all I could do was try to gain time and work out a deal that could save his life." At first Messier tried to prevent a trial. He met with the regime's leaders and asked to be allowed to see Cohen in order to make him sign Messier's appointment as his attorney. His demand was flatly rejected. Yet Messier found out very soon that he had some allies in certain governing circles who treated the world public opinion with respect. They wanted a trial where the rights of the accused would be protected. They were supported, for a totally different reason, by the hawkskin the military establishment, sworn enemies of Hafez, who wanted to expose the president's close ties with Tabet in open court. Such a trial, they thought, would make public the corruption of the regime and undermine its position. But this approach was bitterly opposed by another group, all those who had maintained close ties with Tabet. They knew that a public trial could send them to the gallows as well. That faction had one single goal: to prevent a public trial at all costs and eliminate Cohen as soon as possible. The trial finally took place before a special military court, behind closed doors, in front of an empty room. Only some portions, duly selected, were broadcast on the state television. There were no prosecuting and no defending attorneys. When Eli Cohen asked the court for a defense attorney, the presiding judge exploded, "You don't need a defender. All the corrupt press is on your side, and all the enemies of the revolution are your defenders. The presiding judge assumed the functions of interrogator, prosecutor, and judge. But the worst of it was that the presiding judge was Brigadier General Salah Dali, formerly Tabet's good friend. Another close, even intimate, friend of Tabet, Colonel Salim Haytham, was among the judges. In order to disprove any rumors of his ties with Cohen, he asked him, "Do you know Salim Haytham?" And the accused, like an actor who follows a detailed script, turned to the empty courtroom, then looked Haytham in the eye, and answered, "No, I don't see him in this room." That portion was shown on television. All of Damascus was laughing at this episode, Messiah said. That was not a trial. That was a tragicomedy, a circus. The television cameras showed Eli Cohen's co-defendants, Elord, Uldin, Seif, a few prostitutes. But who were the other women? Senior officers' wives? Secretaries? Friends of Tabet and of the Ba'ath leaders? And what were the secrets that Cohen had communicated to his Israeli handlers? He was accused of espionage, but throughout the trial not one word was said about the things he did and the contents of his transmissions. The only thing the cameras couldn't hide was the nervous tremor of a muscle in Cohen's left cheek and a repeated sharp tilting of his head. These were results of his torture by electrodes attached to his body and head. Israel followed the trial in silence. Every evening, Eli's family met by the television set the Mossad had loaned them. The children, Nadia, the brothers, were softly crying at the sight of Eli's face on the screen. His mother, on an impulse, kissed the screen and pressed to Eli's face the small Star of David she was wearing on a chain. Sophie called, "This is my daddy. He is a hero." Nadia wept in silence. In Damascus, Messiah would wake up in the middle of the night, bathed in cold sweat and haunted by horrible nightmares. His inutility depressed him deeply. On March 31st, the military court published its verdict. Eli Cohen, Majid Sheikh Elord, and Lieutenant Zaha Uldin were sentenced to death. Messiah launched a new effort. In April and May of 1965, he visited Damascus 3 times. He brought substantial offers from Israel. The first one was a deal. Israel was ready to deliver to Syria medicines and heavy agricultural equipment, estimated worth millions of dollars, for the life of Cohen. The Syrians rejected the offer. Israel then made another offer, to send back to Syria the 11 Syrian spies that had been captured and jailed in Israel. The Syrians rejected that offer, too, but hinted that a presidential pardon wasn't out of the question. On May 1st, Elord's sentence was commuted to life in prison. On May 8th, Eli Cohen's sentence was officially published. The Mossad braced for a last effort. In Paris, Nadia Cohen presented an appeal for clemency at the Syrian embassy. Other appeals came from all over the world. They were signed by world-famous figures like Pope Paul VI and British philosopher Bertrand Russell, statesmen like Francis Edgar Faure and Antoine Pinry, Belgium's Queen Mother Elizabeth and politician Camille Huysmans, and Canadian John Diefenbaker, Italian cardinals and ministers, 22 members of British Parliament, the Human Rights League, the International Red Cross. If Eli had heard about them, he would have remembered the similar appeals that tried in vain to save his friend's lives in Cairo 11 years before. On May 18th, in the middle of the night, Eli Cohen was awakened by his jailers. They dressed him in a long white gown and took him to the Damascus marketplace. They let him write a letter to his family and exchange a few words with the Damascus rabbi, Nissim and Abbo. Syrian soldiers then fastened to his chest a huge poster where his sentence was written in large Arabic letters. The television and newspaper cameras focused on the lone man who went up the stairs to the gallows between 2 rows of armed soldiers. The hangman was waiting, and quickly fastened the noose around Eli's neck. He made the condemned man stand on a low stool. Eli faced the crowd, silent, resigned, but not defeated. The crowd held its breath. They distinctly heard the thump when the stool was pulled out from under his feet. Men and women yelled with delight watching the death throes of the Israeli spy. Large crowds of Damascenes, mysteriously awakened in the wee hours, passed by the gallows for the next 6 hours to view the body. In Israel, the heavy veil of silence was removed in a single moment. In a few hours, Eli Cohen became a national hero. Hundreds of thousands participated in his family's grief. Schools, streets, and parks were named after him. Articles and books described his feats. Nadia did not marry again. Even today, 46 years after Eli Cohen's death, Syria refuses to return his body for burial in Israel. Eli Cohen is considered one of the Mossad heroes. But there are many who point an accusing finger at the Mossad. His family and various writers contend that the Mossad used Eli with extreme recklessness by having him transmit his reports daily, sometimes twice a day. The Mossad even ordered Eli to transmit regularly the debates of the Syrian parliament, even though their importance was almost nil. A pointless task that made Eli run unnecessary risks. Eli Cohen was a great spy, and his end was the end of all great spies. Their overconfidence, and the exaggerated demands of their handlers, led them to their deaths. Did you enjoy learning something new today? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more fascinating knowledge. Your support helps us continue bringing you engaging content. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.